Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves in the echoing marble corridors of 14th century Naples, the air thick with the perfume of imported roses and the faint, sharp tang of copper from freshly polished goblets. You can hear the shuffle of silk slippers on mosaic floors, the clink of gold as servants set the evening table, and somewhere in the distance, a low whisper, not a prayer, not quite gossip, but something heavier, dangerous. You're about to meet Joanna I of Naples, a queen so tangled in scandal that even centuries later, historians still can't agree whether she was a victim of politics or the villain of her own story. You probably won't survive this court if you keep staring like that subtlety is your only armor here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1343, and Joanna has just become Queen of Naples at the tender age of 16. You, in your imaginary silk doublet, are here as part of the vast audience watching her coronation, though half the faces in the crowd are calculating her fall already. Naples is a jewel of the Mediterranean, wealthy from trade, glimmering with art, but also a political powder keg, wedged between rival dynasties and hungry neighbours. Joanna didn't just inherit a crown, she inherited a web of alliances so tangled they could strangle her if she twitched wrong. The mainstream historical fact is that Joanna's reign was marked by one of the most infamous murder cases in medieval Europe, the suspicious death of her first husband, Anjou of Hungary. Only a year after their marriage, Anjou was found strangled during a hunting trip in Aversa. You can almost picture the scene: the royal party lodged for the night, the air humid with the scent of pine and sweat, when a scream pierces the quiet. In the morning, Anjou is laid out pale and still, and whispers are already curling around the corridors like smoke. Here's the quirky tidbit. Medieval Neapolitan court culture believed that royal dreams could predict the future. On the night before his death, Anjou reportedly dreamed of being dragged through dark corridors by unseen hands. The next day, it said he nervously clutched a small charm blessed by a Hungarian priest. Neither the dream nor the charm helped him. You can imagine the nervous laughter of courtiers who remembered it later, each privately wondering if they should start sleeping in armor. Of course, the official inquiry was about as clear as a candlelit room full of incense. Historians still argue whether Joanna orchestrated the killing to rid herself of a politically inconvenient husband, or whether she was framed by those who despised her independence. You stand in the great hall, the marble cold under your feet, as the papal envoy demands answers. Joanna, all composure in a gown of deep crimson, denies every accusation with a voice as steady as church bells. The Hungarian faction seethes. The Neapolitan nobles smirk into their goblets. Imagine trying to navigate that storm. Your in-laws are foreign royalty convinced you murdered their son. Your own nobles are split between loyalty and opportunism, and the Pope is breathing down your neck like a suspicious landlord. Joanna doesn't flinch. Instead, she marries again to Louis of Taranto, her cousin, and more importantly, a man with military muscle. It's a move that makes political sense, but only fuels the whispers. After all, nothing says "I'm innocent" quite like swiftly replacing the dead husband with a cousin from the rival branch of the family tree. You stroll through the royal gardens with her, the scent of lemon blossoms mixing with the faint reek of stagnant fountains. She talks politics in that smooth, almost musical Italian, pointing out which noble families can be bought and which must be broken. Every so often, she laughs not the tinkling laugh of a blushing bride, but the quick, sharp laugh of someone who knows the joke is on everyone else. Her political enemies do not sleep. In 1348, her brother-in-law Louis I of Hungary invades Naples to avenge Anjou's death. You can hear the rumble of hooves, the clang of steel, and the sudden silence of a city under siege. Joanna flees to Provence, and Naples is swallowed by war. It would have been the perfect ending for her enemies if she hadn't returned. Against the odds, she regains her throne, her power as steady as the tides that beat against the city's harbours. Here's another strange detail you'll appreciate. While in Provence, Joanna granted safe passage and protection to poets, scholars, and artists fleeing the Black Death. It's an oddly humane streak in a woman painted by her foes as a cold-blooded killer. You can almost see her in a sunlit courtyard, discussing philosophy with a dusty scholar while soldiers sharpen swords in the background. But the taint of Andrew's death never fades. Decades later, in 1381, Charles of Durazzo, a distant cousin, and yet another claimant to Naples, invades with Hungarian backing. Joanna is captured and imprisoned in the fortress of Muro Lucano. The official record says she died under suspicious circumstances, which in medieval terms is the polite way of saying she was probably murdered. Some say she was smothered with pillows, others that she was strangled, a grim symmetry to Andrew's fate. You picture her final hours, the cold stone walls pressing in, the air heavy with the smell of old rushes, her hands resting on the arm of a wooden chair. Does she think of Andrew? Of the accusations? Or is she still calculating, even now, wondering which cousin will be wearing her crown in a week's time? The irony here is sharp enough to cut parchment. Joanna I of Naples, a queen accused of murder for most of her life, ends her days as the likely victim of it. In death, she becomes a symbol her enemies can brand as villain or martyr, depending on who's telling the story. The court chroniclers write with poisoned quills. The folk ballads soften her into a tragic heroine. You, standing there in the flickering torchlight, can't decide which version you believe. And so we leave her for now, in that half-light between guilt and innocence, her name still echoing through the vaulted halls of history, as much a riddle as a cautionary tale. Somewhere in Naples, the stones still remember her footsteps. You don't get far from Naples before the scent of intrigue pulls you across the channel to the damp stone walls of the English court. It's 1325, and the woman sweeping into view in her dark fur-lined cloak is Isabella of France, Queen of England, daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France. Her eyes are the colour of cold river water, and she has a talent for looking straight through people as if measuring their worth in a heartbeat. They called her the she-wolf of France, and not as a compliment. The title clings to her centuries later, like the musk of an old hunting dog, memorable, a little unpleasant, and impossible to wash off. The mainstream historical fact here is as sharp as a dagger. Isabella was married to Edward II of England, a king more interested in his favourites men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser than in his queen. In a medieval court where appearance was everything, Isabella's position was humiliating. Her dowry, influence and dignity were steadily eroded, and she was forced to watch as Despenser and his family became the true power behind the throne. You're imagining her standing beside Edward during a royal procession, the crowd cheering their monarch, while her jaw tightens just enough to crack a tooth. Now for the quirky tidbit. When tensions with France boiled over, Isabella was sent as a diplomatic envoy to her homeland. But instead of meekly negotiating peace, she stayed in France, dressed in the finest Parisian silks, and began collecting allies like some people collect antique daggers. She even arranged for her teenage son, the future Edward III, to visit her in France, conveniently removing the heir to the English throne from his father's grip. You can almost hear the quiet gasp of the English courtiers back home when they realized the Queen wasn't coming back. Historians still argue whether Isabella's decision to remain abroad was a calculated move from the start or simply a reaction to Edward's mismanagement. But by 1326, the facts were unmissable. Isabella had formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English nobleman with a sharp mind and, if the chroniclers are to be believed, a certain personal appeal to the Queen. They raised an army, invaded England, and toppled Edward II's regime in a campaign so swift it felt more like a coup than a war. Picture it. You're in London, the air thick with wood smoke and tension, as Isabella rides into the city beside Mortimer. Her banners, France's blue fleur-de-lis twined with England's lions, flutter above the streets. Edward II is imprisoned, Despenser is executed in a spectacle too gruesome for bedtime, and Isabella becomes regent for her young son. It's a political victory that should have secured her a heroic reputation. Instead, the whispers begin. The court begins to bristle at her reliance on Mortimer, whose arrogance grows with each passing month. Taxes rise, political enemies are exiled or executed, and Isabella's once carefully cultivated image of the wronged wife morphs into that of a power-hungry ruler. The very nobles who had welcomed her return now mutter that they've simply traded one tyrant for another. You wander through Westminster Hall and catch fragments of conversations, words like greedy, arrogant, and the Frenchwoman slipping between clenched teeth. Here's another curious detail. Isabella's regency wardrobe was extravagant even by medieval standards. She wore gowns embroidered with gold thread so heavy that servants had to help her move gracefully. Her jewellery included a ruby so large that guests reportedly stared at it mid-conversation, losing track of their words. To her supporters, this display was a symbol of royal authority. To her detractors, it was proof that she was bleeding England dry to fund her vanity. By 1330, the tide turns. Edward III, now 17, decides he's had enough of his mother and Mortimer's dominance. In a dramatic midnight coup at Nottingham Castle, Edward's supporters infiltrate the stronghold through a hidden passage, arrest Mortimer, and seize control. You can almost feel the shift in the air from incense-heavy chambers of power to the cold bite of autumn wind in the castle courtyard as Mortimer is dragged away. Isabella, spared execution, is placed under comfortable but humiliating house arrest. There she remains for years, her once commanding voice reduced to murmurs in private gardens, her gowns traded for simpler attire. The irony is sharp. A queen who overthrew her husband for the good of the realm now lives as a political ghost, her name spoken with equal parts fascination and revulsion. If you stroll those gardens with her in her later years, you'd see a woman still proud, still calculating, but softened at the edges. She tends roses, receives select visitors, and occasionally exchanges letters with her son. Letters that are polite but clipped, as if neither has forgotten the power she once wielded. When she dies in 1358, she is buried in the grey habit of a Franciscan nun, a final act of humility that may or may not have been entirely voluntary. Was Isabella the victim of a neglectful husband, justified in her rebellion? Or was she the architect of her own downfall, a queen whose hunger for power devoured the goodwill she once enjoyed? Like Joanna of Naples, she exists in that slippery space where truth and politics blur. And as you step back from her grave, the stone cool beneath your hand, you realize that she-wolf might have been less an insult and more a warning, a creature beautiful, cunning, and lethal, whose bite still echoes through the corridors of English history. The wind off the English Channel smells faintly of salt and cold iron as you step into the 15th century. And this time the woman at the heart of the story is Margaret of Anjou. She arrives in England in 1445, a bride of just 15, with French silk at her back and an unsteady crown ahead. She is the wife of Henry VI, a king with the temperament of a gentle monk, the political instincts of a lamb, and a troubling tendency toward mental breakdowns. You can almost feel the collective calculation in the English court as they watch her step down from the barge. Is she here to save the realm or to sink it? The mainstream historical fact is simple but devastating. Margaret's marriage to Henry was part of a peace deal with France during the 100 Years' War. In exchange for the hand of this French princess, England surrendered valuable territory in Maine and Anjou. The nobles grumbled, the people seethed, and before she had even set foot in Westminster, Margaret was branded a foreigner who cost England its birthright. You stand in the crowded hall during her first official audience, hearing the applause that sounds just a touch too thin, seeing the smiles that are a shade too tight. Here's the quirky tidbit. Margaret was obsessed with hawking, the noble sport of hunting with trained birds. Chroniclers say she kept a personal mews stocked with rare and expensive falcons, some imported from as far as Iceland. To her admirers, it was the pastime of a cultured queen. To her enemies, It was one more sign of extravagance at a time when the treasury was running on fumes. You imagine her releasing a falcon into the crisp morning air, its shadow sliding over the frost, while somewhere back in the city, another noble is penning a letter about her wasteful habits. Historians still argue whether Margaret's eventual dominance in politics was born of necessity or ambition. When Henry's mental health collapsed in 1453, leaving him catatonic for more than a year, Margaret took control of the government. She gathered loyalists, sidelined opponents, and worked to secure the succession for her young son, Edward of Westminster. Some saw this as a queen stepping up to save the kingdom. Others saw a foreign woman overreaching her place. The tension simmers until it boils over into the Wars of the Roses, a civil conflict so tangled that even the heralds must have lost track of who was fighting for which cause. You march beside her in spirit at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, the winter air sharp, banners snapping in the wind. The Lancastrian forces crush their Yorkist foes, and Margaret's reputation as a commander begins to take shape. Yet victory has its own poison. One of the more notorious episodes in her story comes after the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461. Margaret's army captures key Yorkist leaders, and the accounts claim that she allowed, or at least did not prevent, their summary executions. The Yorkist chroniclers had a field day with this, painting her as a bloodthirsty Frenchwoman reveling in the deaths of English lords. You can practically hear the whispered witch in the corners of the hall when her name is mentioned. Her enemies never let her forget her foreign birth. Satirical poems circulate in London depicting her as a harpy perched on the English throne, feathers dripping with blood. The irony is that, despite her deep ties to France, she rarely returned there. England had become both her battlefield and her prison. Still, she clung to the fight for her son's future, rallying armies, negotiating with allies, and risking capture on more than one occasion. Here's another curious detail. During her years in exile after the Yorkists seized the throne, Margaret stayed in a modest chateau in Bar, her birthplace. She reportedly spent hours in the chapel each day, praying for a reversal of fortune, yet also sending coded letters to her supporters in England. In one letter, preserved in faded ink, she used a simple recipe for almond pudding as the cipher key, the ingredients and measurements pointing to troop numbers and locations. By 1471, her fortunes hit rock bottom. The Lancastrian cause suffers a crushing defeat at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her beloved son Edward, now a teenager, is killed. The exact circumstances remain shrouded in dispute. Some say he fell in battle. Others claim he was executed after surrendering. You see her in that moment, face pale, gown torn at the hem, the noise of battle fading into a hollow silence. It is the moment when all her wars, all her plotting dissolve into loss. Captured and brought before Edward IV, the Yorkist king, Margaret is spared the axe but confined in the Tower of London. The walls here are cold and damp, smelling faintly of mould and the Thames, and the echo of her footsteps is the only applause she hears now. 3 years later, she is ransomed by her cousin, King Louis XI of France, and returns to her homeland, but it's no triumphant homecoming. She lives quietly, almost obscurely, in Anjou until her death in 1482, a queen without a crown, a mother without a child. Margaret of Anjou's legacy is as divided as the kingdom she fought for. To some, she was a warrior queen who dared to take the reins when men faltered. To others, she was a meddling foreigner who brought nothing but war and misery to England. You stand in the shadow of her tomb in Angers Cathedral, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass, painting her effigy in shards of blue and red. Was she the saviour of her dynasty or its destroyer? Perhaps both. Either way, her name is still sharp enough to cut, and her story still hums like a taut bowstring across the centuries. The air in Constantinople is warm with the scent of spiced honey cakes and the salty breath of the Bosporus as you enter the court of the Byzantine Empire in the 9th century. Here, behind the gold-tiled walls of the great palace, lives Aelia Eudocia Ingerina Empress, mistress and stepmother, depending on which court whisper you catch. Her story is a tangle of personal scandal and imperial politics so intertwined that even the most skilled court scribe would struggle to keep the margins clean. The mainstream historical fact is that Eudocia Ingerina was first the mistress of Emperor Michael III, and then, through an arrangement that only Byzantium could make sound dignified, the wife of his trusted friend and eventual successor, Basil I. The complication? Michael insisted she continue as his mistress even after marrying Basil. Imagine it your wedding day, a crown on your head, and the groom is already aware you're keeping the emperor's company after dark. It's not so much a love triangle as an imperial geometry problem. Here's the quirky tidbit. Byzantine gossip wasn't whispered in corridors. It was painted in mosaics and embroidered in silk. Ingerina was once depicted in a court tapestry holding a lily and a pomegranate, symbols of purity and fertility. The joke, among those bold enough to share it, was that the lily belonged to Basil but the pomegranate was Michael's. It was the kind of jab that could cost you your tongue if you told it too loudly. Historians still argue whether Basil's eventual rise to power was engineered by Michael, by Ingerina herself, or simply by fate. What is clear is that when Michael III was assassinated in 867, Basil became emperor and Eudocia was officially empress. This should have been her moment of triumph, but instead it cemented her as a divisive figure. Many at court believed she had known of the plot against Michael or even encouraged it. The fact that her son, Leo VI, was rumoured to be Michael's biological child rather than Basil's only poured oil on the fire. You walk with her through the imperial gardens, where peacocks strut and fountains gurgle, their water sparkling in the midday light. She speaks with the controlled precision of someone who knows every word might be weighed against her. Her robes are a shimmer of deep blue, the fabric heavy with gold thread. Every movement is watched, every smile dissected. Servants bow low, but you can sense the tension in their shoulders, the subtle hesitation before they meet her gaze. Byzantine court life was an elaborate theatre, and Eudocia played her role with remarkable skill. She sponsored church renovations, hosted lavish receptions, and ensured the imperial family was seen at religious festivals. Yet every public act was shadowed by private suspicion. Did she truly love Basil? Or was she simply ensuring her survival in a world where a discarded mistress could end up in a convent or worse? Here's another detail worth savouring. Ingerina reportedly kept a small private chapel within the palace, decorated with icons gifted from distant monasteries. One icon, of the Virgin Mary, was said to have a hidden compartment in the frame. Some claimed she kept personal letters there. Others whispered it contained a lock of Michael III's hair. No one dared confirm it aloud, but the rumour alone was enough to keep the palace buzzing for years. The tension in her life reached its peak during the succession crisis. When Basil died in 886 and her son Leo VI took the throne, the question of his paternity flared again. The new emperor honoured her publicly, but privately, the relationship between mother and son was complicated. Some said even strained by the legacy of whispers that dogged them both. You imagine them standing side by side at a public liturgy, their faces composed, their eyes giving nothing away, while the congregation silently calculates which emperor's blood truly flows in Leo's veins. Life in the Byzantine court was never free of danger, and Eudocia knew it. She had navigated a marriage that was half political arrangement, half personal humiliation, and emerged with a crown still on her head. She had survived the assassination of one emperor, the suspicious death of another, and the icy politics of an empire that devoured the unwary. Yet survival came at a cost. By the time she died, likely in the 892nd, though the exact date has been lost to history, her reputation was a patchwork of contradictions. To her allies, she was a shrewd political survivor who protected the dynasty through turbulent times. To her enemies, she was the embodiment of court corruption, a woman whose personal entanglements blurred the line between love and treachery. Standing now in the echoing halls of the great palace, you can almost hear the faint clatter of her slippers on marble, the murmur of servants ducking into alcoves as she passes. Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of desire, loyalty, betrayal, and ambition, the kind of fabric that frays at the edges but holds together just long enough to be remembered. And perhaps that is why she lingers in the pages of history, not as a saintly empress or a tyrant, but as something more dangerous, a woman who knew exactly how much scandal she could survive and who wore it as part of her regalia. The smell of incense and candle wax curls through the air as you step into the court of late 13th century Brittany, where Isabella of France, Duchess of Brittany, sometimes called the Other, Isabella of her generation, sits on a carved oaken chair, her fingers wrapped around a gilded rosary. The surface piety is impeccable, the gentle bow of her head, the serene gaze lifted toward the crucifix on the wall. But here, faith is less about salvation and more about strategy. This is a woman who has learned that religion can be the sharpest blade in the armory. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabella was married to John II, Duke of Brittany, in a politically advantageous match binding France and Brittany more tightly together. She was also the daughter of Louis IX of France, Saint Louis himself, which meant her very presence at court radiated royal legitimacy and moral authority. The trouble was, Isabella was not content to be a ceremonial figure. She wielded her royal bloodline like a cudgel, pressing her influence into disputes both secular and sacred. When her husband's rivals questioned her power, she positioned herself as the voice of divine justice, declaring that opposing her was tantamount to opposing God's will. Here's the quirky tidbit. Isabella was known to send gilded prayer books as diplomatic gifts, but she always had the scribes alter certain psalms to include veiled references to loyalty and obedience conveniently framed as moral duties. Imagine receiving a velvet-bound volume from the Duchess, opening to find a beautifully illuminated page that, if you read between the gold leaf lines, is essentially telling you to fall in line or risk damnation. Historians still argue whether Isabella's overt piety was genuine devotion or calculated theatre. Some chroniclers admired her as a protector of the church. Others muttered that she was more concerned with controlling the bishoprics than saving souls. The tension came to a head when she openly clashed with local clergy over land rights, using papal authority to back her claims. The clergy might have worn the vestments, but Isabella wore the crown, and in medieval politics, that was the greater vestment of all. You walk beside her through the cathedral at Nantes, where she pauses at each chapel to light a candle. The stone vaults carry the echoes of her measured footsteps. She stops before a statue of Saint Michael, the archangel with a sword in his hand and a dragon underfoot. Her lips curve in the faintest smile. The image, after all, must feel familiar. Isabella's most notorious political move came during the dispute between Brittany and the French crown over feudal obligations. While her husband hesitated, Isabella used her connections at the French court to push through policies that favoured her position, often at Brittany's expense. This earned her the ire of local nobles, who saw her as a French agent undermining Breton independence. Some called her the nun with a dagger, a nickname she surely never discouraged. Here's another curious detail. Isabella commissioned a chapel within the ducal palace, decorated entirely in blue and gold, the colours of the French fleur-de-lis. The Breton heraldry was noticeably absent, a not-so-subtle reminder of where her loyalties lay. Visitors who entered were greeted by frescoes of French saints performing miracles, each scene framed by lilies instead of the ermine tails that symbolized Brittany. It was as much a political statement as a religious one. The resentment she stirred was not confined to whispers. At least once, a plot to diminish her influence reached her ears, and she responded with what could only be described as holy intimidation. A public procession in which she carried a relic said to contain a fragment of the true cross, flanked by armed guards. The message was clear: she had both heaven and muscle on her side. But the strength of her position was always tethered to her family's grip on the French throne. When her brother Philip III died and the crown passed to her nephew, her influence began to wane. Younger, sharper courtiers took her place in royal councils, and in Brittany, the nobles who had long chafed under her authority began to reclaim lost ground. You see her in these later years, seated in the private oratory of the palace, her hands still clasped in prayer but her eyes distant, calculating her next move even as the candles burn low. Here's the irony. Isabella outlived many of her rivals, surviving into her mid-40s, a respectable age for a noble woman in the 13th century, yet her reputation in Brittany never recovered. To the French, she was a loyal daughter of the Capetian line. To the Bretons, she was the meddling outsider who dressed her ambition in the robes of sainthood. On the day of her death in 1270, the cathedral bells tolled, and official mourning was declared. But behind closed doors, some noble households marked the day with feasts rather than fasting, relieved that the duchy might finally breathe without her shadow stretching across its politics. You stand at her tomb, where an angel carved in white marble keeps watch over her effigy. The stone face is serene, almost gentle, but you know better. Because Isabella of France was no meek consort. She was a strategist who learned early that the Bible, in the right hands, could be wielded like a sword, and that a prayer said loudly enough could silence even the most dangerous opposition. Whether she was saintly or scheming is still debated, but one thing is certain. She knew how to turn faith into power, and power into fear. The smell of scorched grain still hangs in the air as you enter the Castilian court in the mid-14th century, where famine gnaws at the countryside and resentment simmers in the hearts of the people. In the midst of it all sits Blanche of Bourbon, Queen of Castile, a woman whose reign is less about ruling and more about enduring, though even that becomes a dangerous art. Her crown is light in gold, but heavy in consequence. The mainstream historical fact is a grim one. Blanche married King Peter of Castile in 1350. 3. A political union meant to strengthen ties between Castile and France. Yet within days of the wedding, Peter abandoned her, claiming he had been deceived about her dowry. Some chronicles suggest she was placed under virtual house arrest, a pawn in a larger political struggle. From that moment on, Blanche's position was both isolated and perilous. Here's the quirky tidbit. Despite her confinement, Blanche maintained a small court of attendants, insisting on elaborate meals and ceremony even in her captivity. She reportedly had her servants serve her from gilded dishes, and insisted that her wine be poured into silver goblets, a stubborn display of queenly dignity that infuriated her enemies. The image is almost absurd, a queen dressed in fine silks, dining alone in a guarded chamber, clinging to protocol as though it were armor. Historians still argue whether Blanche's insistence on maintaining these luxuries was a calculated political statement or simply an ingrained habit from her royal upbringing. To her supporters, it was a way of preserving the monarchy's dignity in the face of humiliation. To her detractors, it was the petulance of a spoiled foreign princess while her adopted kingdom starved. As you walk the echoing corridors of the fortress where she's kept, you can hear the muffled conversations of guards outside her chamber. They talk of the countryside of fields gone barren and peasants who can't pay their rents. Meanwhile, Blanche's treasury is rumoured to hold untouched chests of coin and jewels. Whether that wealth is real or imagined hardly matters. The idea alone stokes resentment. Peter, for his part, uses Blanche's continued isolation as leverage in his political manoeuvres, alternately dangling the possibility of her release or threatening her with harsher confinement. His mistresses, particularly Maria de Padilla, wield more influence at court than the Queen herself. In whispers, Blanche becomes a symbol to some of injustice, to others of foreign arrogance. Here's another curious detail. During her imprisonment, Blanche commissioned a series of embroidered altar cloths depicting scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary. One panel, oddly enough, shows Mary standing atop a treasure chest while angels guard the lock. The symbolism is almost too pointed to be accidental, and you can imagine the quiet smirk on Blanche's face as she oversaw its stitching. The situation takes a darker turn in 1361. The kingdom is in turmoil, alliances are shifting, and Peter faces threats from his half-brothers and rival nobles. It is in this climate that Blanche dies. officially from illness. Yet the speed of her burial and the secrecy surrounding it fuel the inevitable rumors that she was poisoned on Peter's orders, that her death was a convenient way to remove a political liability, that the illness was as fabricated as her marital vows had been loyal. You picture her final days, the once bright silks dulled with wear, the silver goblets tarnished, the candlelight casting long shadows across her chamber walls. Did she regret her defiance, or was she satisfied to have carried herself like a queen to the end? The records are silent, but the silence itself is telling. In the years following her death, Blanche's story becomes a weapon in the hands of Peter's enemies. Chroniclers sympathetic to France paint her as a tragic heroine, a victim of her husband's cruelty and political greed. Others, less charitable, portray her as aloof, detached from the suffering of her subjects, more concerned with preserving her personal grandeur than engaging with the realities of the kingdom she was meant to serve. Standing at what is said to be her burial site, though even that is disputed, you can feel the weight of her contested legacy. The stone is worn smooth, the inscription faint, as if history itself has been trying to erase her. And yet, she lingers, a reminder that in the medieval world, a queen could be hated not only for what she did, but for what she represented. Blanche of Bourbon's story is not one of dramatic battles or sweeping reforms. It is quieter, more claustrophobic, the slow burn of resentment toward a woman who refused to lower herself, even when the walls closed in. In the end, her stubborn dignity may have been her truest act of rebellion, and perhaps the very thing that sealed her fate. The year is 1533, and the air in London hums with the scent of damp stone, hot pitch from shipyards, and the faint perfume of scandal. You're here to meet Anne Boleyn, the woman who managed to turn a king's heart upside down, a kingdom's faith inside out, and the English court into a nest of venomous gossip. To her supporters, she is magnetic and brilliant. To her enemies, she is the serpent in the garden, the one who made Henry VIII eat the apple. The mainstream historical fact is almost too dramatic to need embellishment. Anne was the second wife of Henry VIII. Her marriage made possible only after England broke from the Roman Catholic Church. Her rise was meteoric, her influence undeniable, and her fall spectacular. Crowned queen in 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, but failed to produce the male heir Henry desperately wanted. Over the next 3 years, the political winds shifted against her with the precision of a seasoned executioner. Here's the quirky tidbit. Anne was said to have a 6th fingernail, not quite a full extra finger, but a small nail-like growth on one hand. Whether true or exaggerated, this tiny physical oddity became fodder for her enemies, who whispered it was proof of witchcraft. Imagine a court so primed for drama that a harmless bit of anatomy could be inflated into evidence of consorting with the devil. You can almost hear the muffled giggles behind embroidered sleeves as courtiers pass the rumour along. Historians still argue whether Anne's downfall was inevitable because of her personality, sharp, outspoken, unwilling to fade into the background, or whether she was simply crushed by political necessity when Henry's gaze wandered to Jane Seymour. The charges brought against her in 1536 were as salacious as they were dubious: adultery, incest with her own brother, and treason. To the common people, the accusations painted her as both immoral and dangerous. To her friends, it was a transparent attempt to remove her. You walk the echoing length of the Tower of London's corridors with her, the heavy air smelling faintly of the Thames and old wood smoke. Anne holds her head high, her dark eyes sharp despite the knowledge that the scaffold is already being built. She speaks to her ladies with a kind of fatal elegance, telling them that she is ready to meet her fate, and that she hopes to be remembered as faithful to her king. Whether she believes it or not, she makes sure they do. Her enemies seized on every part of her life to turn public sentiment against her. They mocked her French education, her flirtatious wit, her ability to keep Henry's attention through lively conversation rather than mere beauty. In a court that preferred its queens modest and silent, Anne's refusal to play that role became ammunition for those who wanted her gone. Here's another curious detail. In her final days, Anne requested a French swordsman for her execution, instead of the traditional English axeman. She claimed it would be quicker and less painful. But it was also a subtle act of control, one last opportunity to set the terms, however small, of her own death. The swordsman was brought to the tower at dawn, his blade wrapped in cloth to avoid attracting attention. The morning of May 19, 1536, arrives cool and pale. Anne walks to the scaffold in a gown of grey damask, over which she wears a crimson robe the colour of martyrdom in Tudor symbolism. She speaks calmly to the gathered crowd, declaring her loyalty to Henry and asking God to protect him. No bitterness, no public accusation, only a careful, final performance, as if even now she is aware that history's pen is hovering above the page. The blade falls, and just like that, the woman who redefined England's religious and political landscape is gone. Her body is buried in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel, but her story takes on a life of its own. Supporters whisper of her innocence, of a bright mind extinguished too soon. Enemies shake their heads and say it was divine justice. In the years to come, her daughter Elizabeth will sit on the throne for over 4 decades, ruling with the same intelligence, wit, and steel spine that Anne once displayed in Henry's court. And every time Elizabeth defies her enemies, you can almost hear the echo of Anne's voice, quick, clever, unafraid. Standing in the tower's chapel now, you can feel the quiet weight of her absence. The stone floor beneath your feet is cool, and the flicker of a single candle dances against the dark. Anne Boleyn remains one of England's most polarizing queens, loved, hated, but never forgotten. And maybe that was her greatest victory, ensuring that even in death she could not be erased. The Loire Valley smells of wet stone and rosemary this spring of 1152, when you first see Eleanor of Aquitaine stride into the French court. She's barely 30, but she carries herself with the poise of a general and the flair of a troubadour's muse. Her gown is deep green, her hair crowned with a circlet that glints in the candlelight, and her eyes are sharp enough to cut through the pleasantries like a dagger through silk. This is a woman who has been both Queen of France and Queen of England, and whose reputation in both realms has stirred admiration, scandal, and outright hatred. The mainstream historical fact is that Eleanor's life reads like an epic poem. She married Louis VII of France, accompanied him on the Second Crusade, and then divorced him to marry Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. This switch in alliances didn't just change her life. It shifted the political balance of Western Europe. It also earned her the distrust of the French court and suspicion from the English, who never quite forgave her for bringing so much Aquitanian independence into their politics. Here's the quirky tidbit. During the Second Crusade, Eleanor reportedly insisted on travelling with her ladies-in-waiting, dressed as Amazons, tunics, boots, and swords at their belts, causing clerics to mutter about impropriety and chroniclers to take furious notes. You can almost hear the scandalized gasp of some bearded monk as Eleanor rides past, her hair loose under the Levantine sun. Historians still argue whether Eleanor was the spark that led to the disastrous failure of that crusade, or merely a convenient scapegoat for male blunders. What's certain is that by the time she returned to Europe, her marriage to Louis VII was as brittle as old parchment. The annulment followed, and within weeks she wed Henry, a move so swift that it's hard to believe it wasn't premeditated. The French called it betrayal. The English called it fortune. Eleanor likely called it strategy. You follow her now into the great hall of Poitiers, her court buzzing like a beehive with poets, scholars, and knights. This is the heart of her famous Court of Love, where tales of chivalry and romance are debated with the same seriousness as military campaigns. It's intoxicating and dangerous. The French clergy accuse her of encouraging immorality. English nobles grumble that she wastes time on troubadours instead of governance. Her marriage to Henry II starts as a partnership of equals, their combined lands forming the vast Angevin Empire. But power shared is rarely power kept. As the years pass, Henry's affairs, both political and romantic, strain their bond. When her sons rebel against him in 1173, Eleanor is accused of aiding them. Whether she actively encouraged the revolt or simply failed to stop it is still debated, but the accusation is enough for Henry to have her imprisoned for nearly 16 years. Here's another curious detail. During her imprisonment, Eleanor was allowed a small garden. Chroniclers say she filled it with lavender, sage, and roses, sending the blooms to her daughters and granddaughters, with letters filled with political advice disguised as family news. Imagine the guards carrying those fragrant bundles, unaware they were also delivering coded encouragement to keep the Plantagenet web intact. When Henry dies in 1189, Eleanor emerges from confinement and throws herself into securing the reign of her son, Richard the Lionheart. She travels tirelessly, arranging alliances, negotiating ransoms, and acting as regent while Richard is on crusade. Even in her 70s, she's a political force few dare to challenge, and yet the shadow of her earlier scandals never leaves her. To the French, she's still the queen who abandoned their king for another man. To some English lords, she's the mother of rebellious sons and the wife who humiliated their king. She is adored and despised in equal measure, a balance she seems almost to enjoy. You stand with her in the abbey at Fontevraud in her final years. She moves more slowly now, her hair silvered, but her voice retains that clear, commanding tone. She commissions her own effigy, not a weeping mourner, but a serene figure holding an open book. It's an image of a woman who wrote her own story and dared others to read it. Eleanor dies in 1204 at the age of around 82, an astonishing lifespan for her era. She's buried beside Henry and Richard, the two men whose reigns she shaped in life and in memory. Even in death, her presence looms queen of two kingdoms, duchess of a third, and ruler of her own legend. And as you look at that stone effigy, lips carved in the faintest of smiles, you wonder if she knew she'd be remembered as both heroine and villain. The answer, you suspect, is yes, and that's exactly how she wanted it. The salt wind from the English Channel carries the faint toll of church bells as you arrive in the year 1403, the reign of Henry IV, where Joan of Navarre steps into the role of Queen of England. She is elegant, composed, and by all outward signs a dutiful wife to the king. But beneath that polished exterior, whispers already stir, the sort of whispers that grow teeth in the long nights of medieval politics. The mainstream historical fact is that Joan of Navarre was the widow of John IV, Duke of Brittany, before marrying Henry IV of England. This was not just a love match, it was a political union that brought stability to Brittany and secured English influence on the continent. For a time, she was respected for her wisdom in governance and praised for her role in raising Henry's children from his first marriage. But admiration has a short shelf life in a court where power and money are never far from envy. Here's the quirky tidbit. Joan kept a personal astrologer who was said to draw up horoscopes for her stepchildren, including the young Henry V. According to gossip, she once refused to allow a particular wedding date because the stars would not bless it. Whether true or embroidered in the telling, it gave her an air of mysterious influence, one that some found fascinating, others deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether Joan's eventual disgrace was political maneuvering by her enemies or the result of genuine suspicion. In 1419, several years after Henry IV's death, her stepson Henry V accused her of practicing witchcraft and attempting to harm him through necromancy. This was no small charge. Witchcraft in the medieval mind was not only heresy, it was treason when aimed at the king. The court went into a frenzy, and Joan was placed under house arrest, her vast dower lands seized by the crown. You can picture her in the chill of her confinement at Pevensey Castle, a damp, windswept fortress on the Sussex coast. The wind rattles the shutters at night. The sea spray leaves a faint salt crust on the stone floors, and the only company she keeps are a few loyal servants and the occasional guard willing to gossip. Joan is too proud to protest her innocence publicly, but she sends quiet petitions to the king, always signed with the formal, "Your most humble and obedient mother." The charges against her are thin, suspiciously so. The so-called evidence includes testimony from a clerk who claimed she paid for magical works and a list of herbs and potions found among her belongings. In reality, such items were common in noble households for medical and cosmetic purposes, but in a time of paranoia and superstition, they were enough to smear her name. Here's another curious detail. While imprisoned, Joan was still allowed a small allowance to maintain her household, but it was so meagre she had to dismiss many of her attendants. She chose to keep only those who had served her in Brittany, perhaps because she trusted them more than English courtiers. This choice fueled further rumours that she was plotting with foreign agents, that coded messages were being sent in baskets of laundry or tucked into loaves of bread. In 1422, 6 years after her arrest, Henry V died unexpectedly in France, and his infant son became Henry VI. One of the young king's first acts, carried out by his Regency Council, was to release Joan and restore her property. The official records note no apology, no formal clearing of her name. She simply steps back into public life as though nothing had happened, though the shadow of the accusations lingers. When you walk with her through her restored estate at Havering Atte Bower in Essex, you see a woman who has learned that silence can be more powerful than protest. She sponsors church repairs, funds masses for the dead, and keeps her personal affairs discreet. The court begins to speak of her again with a sort of wary respect, as though unsure whether to treat her as a victim or a survivor of her own making. Joan dies in 1437, buried at Canterbury Cathedral beside Henry IV. Her effigy shows her in prayer, hands clasped, eyes lifted heavenward, the image of piety. But those who remember her trial know that she once stood accused of the darkest arts, her name nearly ruined by charges that may have been nothing more than political smoke. Was she truly dabbling in forbidden magic, or simply an educated, independent-minded woman in an age that mistrusted both? The answer remains locked in the salt-stained walls of Pevensey and in the yellowed pages of court records, half legible and wholly inconclusive. And as you step back from her tomb, the cathedral's air cool and smelling faintly of beeswax and stone dust, you can still hear the faint echo of those whispers, not of spells, but of the dangerous game of power she played and survived. The wind in Edinburgh bites through your cloak as you arrive in the year 1514, when Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scotland, sits atop a throne balanced between ambition and resentment. She's the sister of Henry VIII, the widow of James IV, and the mother of the infant James V, which makes her both the most important woman in Scotland and one of the easiest targets for gossip and hostility. Her rule as regent will test every ounce of her political instinct and invite every kind of suspicion. The mainstream historical fact is that after James IV was killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, Margaret became regent for her young son. The Scottish lords swore loyalty to her, but in practice, they saw her as a temporary steward until they could seize power for themselves. English by birth and Tudor to the bone, Margaret was never fully trusted in her adopted country. Her regency was conditional on her remaining a widow, a condition she broke within a year by marrying Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus. The ink on the marriage contract was barely dry before her enemies pounced, declaring she'd forfeited her role as regent. Here's the quirky tidbit. Margaret was famously meticulous about her wardrobe, keeping detailed inventories of her gowns, furs, and jewellery. One surviving list includes a gown of crimson damask with sleeves of cloth of gold, and a black velvet kirtle trimmed in sable. For a queen fighting to keep her grip on power, the clothing wasn't just fashion, it was armour, a way of projecting majesty even as her political ground crumbled. Historians still argue whether her marriage to Angus was an act of romantic folly or a calculated alliance gone wrong. What's certain is that it alienated key factions in the Scottish nobility and gave her enemies the excuse they needed to sideline her. The Duke of Albany, acting with French support, took control as regent. Margaret, pregnant and politically cornered, fled Scotland in a harrowing journey through winter roads to seek refuge in England. You can picture her carriage rattling over icy tracks, her fingers numb despite the layers of fur, her mind turning over the betrayal she's just suffered. Her infant son remains in Edinburgh, a pawn in the hands of men she doesn't trust. In London, her brother Henry VIII greets her warmly enough, but even he sees her primarily as a tool in his ongoing chess match with Scotland and France. From this point on, Margaret's life becomes a cycle of shifting alliances. She reconciles with Angus, then breaks with him. She courts Albany's favour, then turns against him. Each shift brings new enemies and erodes her credibility further. And through it all, she demands the royal income due to her, which brings us to her nickname among some of the Scottish gentry, the Tax Queen. She pressed for her own dower lands and revenues with a relentlessness that many saw as greed, especially in years when bad harvests left the common people struggling to survive. Here's another curious detail. Margaret was known to keep a small, locked coffer filled not with gold, but with promissory notes, legal writs, and marriage contracts. In a world where physical coin was scarce, these scraps of parchment were the real currency of power promises she could cash in when the timing suited her. It's tempting to imagine her at night, the coffer open on her lap, weighing which agreements to honour and which to let rot. By the 1522nd, her marriage to Angus has soured beyond repair. She accuses him of stealing her revenues and undermining her position. He accuses her of scheming against him with other nobles. Eventually, with the backing of her son now old enough to take an active role, she manages to have Angus driven out of Scotland. For a brief period, she regains influence at court, but the years of political infighting have taken their toll on her reputation. Margaret spends her later years in Edinburgh and Stirling, often in financial difficulty despite her royal status. She petitions her brother in England for support, but Henry VIII is rarely generous. The image of her as a tax queen persists, partly because she never stops pushing for her own income even when public opinion is against her. In 1538, she marries for a third time to Henry Stuart, Lord Methven, a match that brings her little political advantage and even less personal happiness. She dies in 1541, aged 51, at Methven Castle. Her will, in a twist that seems perfectly in character, names neither her son the king nor her brother as her chief beneficiary, but rather her third husband. It is an act that baffles and angers those who knew her. One final reminder that Margaret Tudor played by her own rules, even when those rules alienated her allies and fed her enemies' hatred. Standing in the cold stone nave of the Carthusian priory where she is buried, you can almost hear the echo of her determined voice, insisting on her rights, her income, her due respect. Was she a greedy outsider who cared little for Scotland's hardships, or a savvy survivor who refused to be erased by the men around her? The truth, as ever, lies somewhere in the draughty space between the two. The air in Paris in the summer of 1530 is heavy with the mingled scents of roasting meat, horse dung, and the faint perfume of orange blossom wafting from the royal gardens. Through the ornate gates of the Louvre Palace glides Catherine de' Medici, barely 14 years old and already an object of fascination and suspicion. She has just been married to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the future Henry II of France, and though she is an orphan of one of Europe's wealthiest families, her Italian birth and Medici blood will shadow her reputation for the rest of her life. The mainstream historical fact is that Catherine's arrival in France was met with mixed feelings. Her dowry was enormous, her connections formidable, but she was Italian in a court that distrusted foreigners, especially ones linked to the banking dynasties of Florence. Her marriage was politically useful, but personally loveless. Henry openly favoured his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, leaving Catherine to navigate the dangerous currents of French court life with charm, patience, and an unshakable survival instinct. Here's the quirky tidbit. Catherine brought with her a retinue of Italian cooks who introduced the French court to artichokes, spinach, and most famously the use of the fork. At banquets, she insisted on these innovations, sparking gossip that she was refining France to the point of weakness. You can almost hear the mutters of conservative courtiers as they fumble awkwardly with the strange pronged utensils. Historians still argue whether Catherine's later reputation as a schemer was earned or exaggerated. What is certain is that after Henry II's sudden death in a jousting accident in 1559, she stepped into the role of Queen Mother and regent for her young son, Francis II. In this position, she became the axis around which France's volatile wars of religion spun, and not everyone liked the way she steered the wheel. You follow her into the council chamber, where nobles shout over each other about the Protestant threat. Catherine, dressed in sombre black mourning, listens more than she speaks, her dark eyes flicking from face to face. When she finally speaks, the room stills. She does not shout, she does not threaten. She proposes marriages, alliances, and political games that keep her enemies close and her family in power. To her supporters, it is masterful statecraft. To her detractors, it is the work of a dangerous puppet mistress, pulling France into chaos. One of her most controversial acts was arranging the marriage of her Catholic daughter, Margaret of Valois, to the Protestant Henry of Navarre. The wedding in 1572 was meant to unite the kingdom. Instead, it became the tinderbox for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. For days, Paris ran red with the blood of murdered Protestants, and although Catherine denied giving any such order, her enemies quickly cast her as the architect of the slaughter. Here's another curious detail. Catherine was fascinated by astrology. She kept the astrologer Cosimo Ruggieri at court, consulting him on matters ranging from the timing of royal journeys to the birth of her grandchildren. She even had an observation tower built into the Tuileries Palace for stargazing. To her enemies, this was proof of occult leanings. To Catherine, it was simply another tool for anticipating fate. As the years passed, her political maneuvers earned her as many enemies as they did victories. Pamphlets circulated portraying her as a poisoner, a witch, a she-wolf cloaked in widow's black. Some of this was xenophobia. Some was the lingering resentment of nobles who felt manipulated by a woman they could neither control nor entirely trust. You stand with her in her later years, when her health is failing but her mind remains sharp. She knows her legacy is already being written, and not by her friends. She spends her last months shuffling between royal residences, advising her surviving sons and trying to hold the fragile kingdom together. In January 1589, she dies, her influence fading only because there is no one left to wield it. Even in death, she remains polarizing. To some, Catherine de' Medici was the steady hand that kept France from total collapse in an age of religious madness. To others, she was the very embodiment of that madness, cloaking ruthless ambition in the silks of diplomacy. Standing at her tomb in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, you trace the carved folds of her effigy and wonder whether her famous Italian pragmatism ever gave way to regret. The marble offers no answer. The dusty streets of Valladolid hum with the chatter of merchants and the clop of hooves as Isabella of Portugal makes her way toward the Alcazar, her gown brushing over the stone steps like a whisper. It is 1447, and she has just married King John II of Castile, a match sealed with diplomatic promise, whispered alliances, and the quiet rattle of gold coins. But those coins, as it turns out, will become the heartbeat of her legend, and not in a flattering way. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabella of Portugal entered this marriage as part of a grand political strategy linking Portugal and Castile. She was celebrated for her beauty and refinement, and her dowry was rumoured to be immense. Yet within a year of her wedding, the wealth she brought seemed to vanish into thin air. The court noticed. The people noticed. Whispers began. The vanishing dowry became a subject for poets, pamphleteers, and anyone with an axe to grind against the queen. Here's the quirky tidbit. Isabella was an avid collector of perfume bottles, commissioning ornate silver flasks from artisans in Lisbon. Chroniclers claimed she always kept at least one at her side, even in council meetings. For some courtiers, this habit was charming. For others, it was a sign she was more concerned with luxury than governance. More than one satirist joked that her dowry had evaporated into scented air. Historians still argue whether the missing dowry was truly squandered by Isabella, mismanaged by the king, or absorbed into the complex web of debts and military expenses that plagued Castile at the time. The problem was perception. The kingdom was not wealthy, and her public displays of opulence, brocade gowns heavy with pearls, elaborate banquets in times of famine painted her as a queen indifferent to the struggles of her subjects. You walk beside her through the corridors of the Alcazar, sunlight filtering through lattice windows onto tiles painted in cobalt and gold. She moves with deliberate grace, a woman who knows she is being watched, and will not give her enemies the satisfaction of catching her in a moment of weakness. Servants bow low as she passes, but in the courtyard beyond, the murmurs of merchants drift upward. The queen spends while the coffers bleed. Her most controversial move came when she petitioned for control of several lucrative towns as part of her dower rights towns that were strategic trade hubs. By claiming them, she not only increased her personal revenue, but also pulled resources away from noble families who had long relied on them. The backlash was immediate. Scribes in the market stalls began producing crude woodcuts of a queen with a treasure chest for a stomach, swallowing gold coins whole. Here's another curious detail. Isabella was known for hosting midnight councils, intimate gatherings in her private chambers, where key political discussions were held away from prying ears. These sessions were lit only by clusters of candles and often accompanied by platters of sugared almonds and imported wine. To her allies, it was a savvy way to avoid the public theatre of the court. To her enemies, it was proof she was plotting in the shadows. Over time, the gossip about her dowry and spending habits hardened into something more permanent. Even when she funded church restorations and charitable works, those deeds were reframed as self-serving a way to buy back goodwill with the same coin she was accused of hoarding. The perception stuck. She was the queen who took more than she gave. By the final years of her life, Isabella retreated from much of public life, spending long stretches in her private estates. Yet even there, she maintained her luxurious habits, importing fabrics from Florence and spices from the Levant. When she died in 1496, her will listed a staggering inventory of jewels, silks, and gold plate enough to confirm, in the eyes of her critics, that she had always been a custodian of wealth rather than a servant of the realm. Standing at her tomb in the royal monastery of San Geronimo, you can almost feel the weight of that reputation pressing down through the centuries. The marble effigy shows her serene, hands folded in prayer, but her story is a reminder of how quickly wealth, in the wrong political climate, can curdle into suspicion. Was Isabella of Portugal a careless spendthrift, or simply a queen caught in the crossfire of economic hardship and noble jealousy? The truth is likely more complicated, but in the markets of 15th century Castile, the legend was simpler. The dowry came in full and vanished like smoke. The clang of cathedral bells rings over the city of Mainz in the mid-11th century, and the Rhine glitters under the pale spring sun. Inside the imperial palace, Agnes of Poitou adjusts the folds of her mantle, the embroidered crosses at her hem catching the light. As Holy Roman Empress and widow of Emperor Henry III, she now rules as regent for her young son, Henry IV. To her allies, she is a dignified guardian of the realm. To her enemies, she is a woman out of her depth, and in the brutal politics of the empire, that is enough to make her dangerous. The mainstream historical fact is that Agnes served as regent from 1056 to 1062, a role she never sought but was forced into by her husband's sudden death. She faced the challenge of balancing the power of the German princes, the restless Italian territories, and the authority of the Church, all while protecting her son's right to the throne. But her cautious diplomacy was interpreted by some as weakness, and in the game of medieval politics, perceived weakness is blood in the water. Here's the quirky tidbit. Agnes had a habit of sending elaborate embroidered garments to bishops and abbots as diplomatic gifts, each stitched with her personal emblem, a silver dove. The dove was meant to symbolize peace, but critics at court snidely referred to it as the bird that will not fight, using it as shorthand for what they saw as her unwillingness to confront her rivals head-on. Historians still argue whether her approach to governance was genuinely too passive, or simply the only realistic strategy for a female regent in a turbulent empire. Her refusal to favour one powerful faction over another alienated them all in turn. This lack of firm alliances left her isolated, and in 1062, her position was fatally undermined in an event that chroniclers would later describe with relish, the coup of Kaiserswerth. You can see it unfolding. The Archbishop of Cologne, Anno II, invites young Henry IV on a river voyage. Mid-journey, the boy is seized, spirited away, and placed under the Archbishop's guardianship. The justification is that Henry's education and governance are in peril under his mother's watch. The reality is that Agnes has just been outmaneuvered in spectacular fashion. Her son's custody is gone, and with it, her authority. The blow is devastating. Agnes retreats from the political centre, handing over much of her power to trusted nobles and bishops. Publicly, she frames it as a deliberate choice for the good of the empire. Privately, it is a recognition that the tide has turned against her. You walk with her through the quiet corridors of the convent she increasingly frequents, the scent of beeswax and incense replacing the heavy odour of the imperial court. Here's another curious detail. After her withdrawal from politics, Agnes was reported to have sent letters to her former rivals, letters written in a tone so gracious and conciliatory that some believed they were laced with subtle barbs. One to the Archbishop of Cologne thanked him for his paternal concern for her son, a phrase that, in its careful politeness, could be read as either genuine gratitude or icy sarcasm. By 1065, Henry IV comes of age and begins his personal rule. Agnes, by then fully retired from public life, enters a convent in Rome, devoting herself to religious work. Yet her reputation as a regent is still debated in the imperial diet. Was she too soft, too unwilling to use force when it was necessary? Or was she a pragmatic ruler who avoided plunging the realm into civil war? The answer depends on whether one sees her dove emblem as a symbol of virtue or a warning of vulnerability. She dies in 1077, far from the court that once swirled around her. Her burial in St. Peter's Basilica is an honour, but it does little to change the way she is remembered in the German principalities as a ruler whose restraint was mistaken for weakness, and whose reluctance to play the brutal game of exile and execution cost her the trust of the nobility. Standing in the echoing basilica, the marble cool under your fingertips, you imagine the silver dove emblem, once worn proudly, now lying buried with her. In her lifetime, it was a promise of peace. In death, it is a reminder of how easily promises are broken when power is at stake. The smell of wood smoke and wet stone rises from the valley as you approach Canossa in the winter of 1077. Snow clings to the crenellations of the fortress, and the banners of Matilda of Tuscany ripple in the wind. She is the most powerful noblewoman in Italy, a countess whose lands stretch from the Apennines to the Alps, and a commander whose reputation for both generosity and ruthlessness has made her feared in equal measure. In the decades to come, her name will be etched into history as a defender of the papacy, but also as a figure whose methods left scars that never healed. The mainstream historical fact is that Matilda was a staunch ally of Pope Gregory VII during the investiture controversy, the bitter struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the right to appoint bishops. When Emperor Henry IV came south to seek absolution from the Pope in 1077, it was at Matilda's fortress of Canossa that the famous humiliation occurred. Henry, barefoot in the snow, waiting 3 days before being admitted. This spectacle solidified her image as a kingmaker in ecclesiastical politics, but also cemented the hatred of imperial loyalists. Here's the quirky tidbit. Matilda was known for wearing chainmail beneath her ceremonial gowns during periods of unrest. Chroniclers claimed she would sometimes attend banquets in full courtly dress while secretly armed, ready to ride into battle at a moment's notice. The notion of a countess with a dagger strapped to her thigh beneath silk skirts became a favourite talking point for her enemies, who saw it as proof she was more warlord than lady. Historians still argue whether Matilda's military campaigns were acts of necessary defense or displays of personal ambition. Her sieges were infamous for their severity. She was not above starving a garrison into submission or ordering the destruction of surrounding farmland to break the will of her enemies. In the Lombard towns that resisted her, she was remembered not as a pious defender of the church, but as the siege mistress who left ashes in her wake. You walk with her along the ramparts of Canossa, the snow crunching beneath your boots. Below, the valley is dotted with frozen farmsteads, some rebuilt after earlier conflicts, others abandoned. Matilda points toward the horizon where imperial forces once massed, her voice low but steady as she recounts how each skirmish reshaped the political map. Her loyalty to the Pope is unshakable, but she has little patience for the finer points of diplomacy. To her, alliances are forged in battlefields, not in council chambers. Her critics were quick to exploit this image. Imperial propagandists circulated tales of her cruelty, claiming she kept prisoners chained in underground cells and ransomed them for outrageous sums. While these stories may have been exaggerated, her readiness to use force against both secular and ecclesiastical rivals made them believable. Even within the church, some clerics grumbled that her methods tarnished the very cause she championed. Here's another curious detail. Matilda was a great patron of manuscript production, particularly military treatises and theological works that justified resistance to unjust rulers. In one surviving codex, her likeness appears in the margins, a small armed figure offering a sword to a crowned pope. It's propaganda, of course, but also a glimpse into how she wanted to be remembered, the sword arm of the church. As the investiture controversy dragged on, Matilda's resources were strained, her lands raided, and her alliances tested. Yet, she never wavered. When she died in 1115, she left most of her vast estates to the papacy, a final gesture that enraged the emperor's supporters and triggered decades of legal disputes. To some, this was proof of her unwavering devotion. To others, it was the ultimate act of treachery against the secular order. Standing in the shadow of Canossa's weathered walls, you can almost hear the clatter of armor beneath silk, the low chant of soldiers around a winter fire, the measured steps of a woman who balanced faith and force with the same hand. Matilda of Tuscany remains a paradox, saintly in her loyalty, formidable in her strategy, and merciless in her pursuit of victory. Whether history sees her as a holy warrior or an unrepentant warlord depends entirely on where you choose to stand on the snowy ground beneath her fortress. The streets of London in the spring of 1464 are slick with rain, and the smell of river mud lingers in the air as Elizabeth Woodville steps into the royal spotlight. Her marriage to King Edward IV has just been revealed, a match that stunned the English nobility. She is not of royal blood. She is a widow from the Lancastrian side of the Civil War, and worst of all to her critics, the marriage was done in secret, bypassing the usual parade of political negotiation. To the court, it is a love story gone wrong before it has even begun. The mainstream historical fact is that Elizabeth's sudden elevation from gentry to queen enraged many in Edward's circle, most notably his cousin, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Warwick had been planning a politically advantageous marriage for Edward, possibly to a French princess, and the king's choice of Elizabeth, a woman with no fortune and a family of ambitious brothers, was seen as a political insult. Almost immediately, the Woodville family was accused of climbing the social ladder at the expense of established nobility. Here's the quirky tidbit. Elizabeth was famed for her beauty and was said to practice a form of charm magic, not the sinister witchcraft of dark legends, but the folk tradition of carrying protective talismans. Chroniclers note that she always wore a small, intricately carved ivory comb pinned inside her gown, said to have been blessed to turn envy aside. Of course, at court, this talisman became the subject of jokes. A pity it cannot comb the snarls from politics. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's influence over Edward was purely personal or part of a deliberate strategy by the Woodvilles to dominate royal favour. What is certain is that her family's rapid rise caused resentment. Her sisters were married into powerful noble houses, her brothers gained high offices, and her father was made Earl Rivers. For older families who had fought for decades to maintain their rank, it was infuriating to watch a single clan advance so far so fast. You walk with her through the newly redecorated chambers of the Queen's apartments at Westminster, where tapestries depict courtly love and scenes from the lives of saints. Outside, the city seethes with rumours that she used sorcery to ensnare Edward, that she whispers in his ear against his allies, that she encourages him to act on personal whims rather than sound counsel. These accusations are fuel for Warwick's growing discontent, and soon, political disagreement tips into open rebellion. In 1469, Warwick leads an uprising against the king, capturing Edward and executing Elizabeth's father and one of her brothers. It is a brutal blow. Though Edward is eventually restored to power, the episode cements the image of the Woodvilles as a clan whose ambition invites bloodshed. Elizabeth, however, does not retreat from public life. She doubles down, maintaining her presence in court ceremonies, patronizing religious institutions, and presenting herself as the devoted wife and mother of the royal heirs. Here's another curious detail. During these years, Elizabeth was said to personally oversee the upbringing of her children, especially her daughters, ensuring they were well educated and trained in courtly diplomacy. This was unusual for a queen, who might have delegated such duties. It was both a maternal choice and a political one. She was grooming them to be valuable marriage alliances in the ongoing dance of power. But the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses was far from over. In 1470, Edward is briefly deposed, and Elizabeth flees into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Here, among the cold stone pillars and echoing vaults, she gives birth to her son, the future Edward V. The image of the Queen huddled in a sacred space while her husband is in exile becomes a powerful piece of propaganda, both sympathetic and divisive. When Edward regains his throne the following year, Elizabeth's fortunes soar again, yet the cycle of rise and fall is relentless. After Edward's sudden death in 1483, her young son becomes king, but only for a matter of weeks before her brother-in-law, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seizes the crown as Richard III. Her sons are taken to the Tower of London and never seen again, their disappearance becoming one of England's enduring mysteries. Elizabeth is forced once more into political survival mode, eventually negotiating an alliance with Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, by arranging the marriage of her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. The final years of her life are quieter but tinged with the bitterness of loss. Retired to Bermondsey Abbey, she lives modestly, removed from the court she once dominated. The whispers about her ambition and the Woodvilles' greed have not faded. In some circles they have hardened into historical certainty. Yet her daughter's marriage to Henry VII unites the warring houses of Lancaster and York, ending decades of conflict, a resolution that owes no small debt to Elizabeth's determination to remain a player even when the odds were stacked against her. Standing at her tomb in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, you can feel the contradiction that defined her life. A queen accused of grasping ambition who nonetheless secured peace for a fractured kingdom. Was she the usurper's wife who climbed over others to grasp the crown? Or a survivor who navigated the treacherous currents of civil war with skill few could match? In truth, she was both, and it is that duality that keeps her story alive in the shadowed halls of English history. The streets of Paris in the winter of 1389 are slick with frost, and the torchlight from the Palais de la Cité glimmers off the icy Seine. Inside the palace, Isabella of Valois, barely a child of 8, sits on an ornate cushioned stool, staring at the king she has just married. Her new husband, Richard II of England, is 29, a monarch whose reputation is already bruised by political strife at home. This marriage is meant to seal a fragile peace between England and France, but instead it plants the seed for decades of suspicion, resentment, and eventually, hatred toward the young queen. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabella's marriage to Richard was a diplomatic solution to end a phase of the 100 Years' War. The treaty called for a truce lasting 28 years, but to many in England, the price was too high. Their king had married a French princess who was still a child, with no dowry large enough to justify the match. Whispers began before she even set foot in England that she would be an expensive ornament in a court that could barely afford her. Here's the quirky tidbit. Despite her age, Isabella reportedly had a fondness for elaborate headdresses, especially heart-shaped hennins with long trailing veils. English chroniclers noted, sometimes with grudging amusement, that she insisted her ladies-in-waiting match her style, creating a miniature French court within London. It was harmless fashion to her, but to English eyes already primed to distrust her, it became a symbol of foreign arrogance. Historians still argue whether Isabella ever managed to win over any significant English faction. Her youth made her politically powerless, yet she was an easy target for resentment when Richard's policies or expenses drew criticism. The marriage never produced children, and with Richard's growing unpopularity, she was increasingly portrayed as a frivolous, costly burden. You follow her into the cold, draughty halls of Westminster, where the tapestries can't quite keep out the wind. Servants whisper as she passes not out of malice, but because any detail of her life is fair game for the pamphleteers and poets eager to lampoon the French queen. She answers with an aloof grace, her small frame draped in layers of crimson velvet, her voice soft but precise in court French. Her life takes a sharp turn in 1399, when Richard is deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV. At just 10 years old, Isabella finds herself a political liability too young to be a real threat, but too symbolically tied to France to be trusted. Henry offers to marry her to his son, the future Henry V, but she refuses, reportedly saying she would not marry the son of the man who deposed her husband. This defiance, though mild in delivery, was noted with a mix of admiration and anger. Here's another curious detail. While under house arrest in various royal residences, Isabella kept a small book of hours that she annotated with personal prayers in both French and Latin. In one margin, she drew a tiny ship tossed on rough seas, a possible symbol of her own uncertain fate. The image survived, a silent testament to how she saw herself adrift, but still afloat. In 1401, Isabella is sent back to France, her trousseau reduced, her jewels stripped by the English crown as compensation for the broken marriage treaty. She returns to her family not as the Queen of England, but as a young widow with no clear future. Yet in France, she quickly becomes a political asset again. Within 2 years, she is remarried this time to her cousin Charles, Duke of Orleans. It is a happier match by contemporary accounts, though it binds her to yet another player in the endless conflict between England and France. Isabella dies in 1409, at the age of just 19, likely from complications of childbirth. Her body is returned to Blois for burial, her short life already slipping into the footnotes of larger histories. And yet, the image of her as a costly, foreign interloper lingers in English memory, a queen blamed for her husband's political failings simply because her face wore the wrong country's crown. Standing in the quiet of Blois, you can imagine her in those cold English halls, the child queen with the heavy headdress, smiling politely while every glance and every word was weighed against her. Was she the spoiled false saint her enemies claimed, or simply a young girl trapped in the machinery of kings and treaties? Either way, her story reminds you that in medieval politics, innocence was no defense, and sometimes it was the very thing that made you a perfect target. The year is 1328, and the chill of early spring clings to the stone corridors of Pamplona's royal palace. Joan II of Navarre sits in the high-backed cedar chair of the audience chamber, her dark gown heavy with pearls. She is the only surviving legitimate child of King Louis X of France and Navarre, but her path to the throne has been anything but straightforward. Even now, her crown feels precarious, balanced on the twin pillars of family loyalty and ruthless pragmatism. The mainstream historical fact is that Joan's claim to both the French and Navarre's thrones was contested from the moment of her father's death. In France, She was passed over entirely due to the newly asserted Salic law, which barred women from inheriting the crown. Navarre, however, was a different story. There, the law allowed her to rule, but only after a compromise deal with her uncle Philip V. She accepted Navarre in exchange for renouncing her claim to France, a concession that many in her camp saw as a humiliation. Here's the quirky tidbit. Joan kept a collection of intricately carved chess pieces made of walrus ivory, brought from the northern trade routes by a Navarrese merchant. She was known to challenge visiting nobles to games, not just for sport, but to gauge their cunning. Chroniclers claimed she never lost to the same opponent, twice, a reputation that, while charming on the surface, also served as a warning. Historians still argue whether Joan's decision to compromise with her uncle was an act of political foresight or a surrender under pressure. In truth, it set the tone for her reign, pragmatic, but shadowed by the perception that she owed her crown to the generosity or manipulation of her male relatives. You walk with her through the markets of Pamplona, where traders hawk Basque wool and Pyrenean honey. She greets the merchants by name, yet in the shadowed doorways, some still mutter that she is too much under her brother's influence. This brother, Charles IV of France, uses her position as queen to bolster French influence in Navarre, and Joan, in turn, uses French resources to solidify her power. The balance is delicate. In the 1332nd, she faces unrest from the Navarrese nobility, who accuse her of favouring French-born courtiers and raising taxes to fund her projects. These include the expansion of royal fortifications and the renovation of Olite Castle into a lavish residence. While the improvements are undeniably impressive, the expense fuels the growing discontent. The phrase, "our taxes build her towers," begins to circulate in taverns. Here's another curious detail. Joan commissioned a series of tapestries depicting the biblical story of Esther, the queen who saved her people by navigating the intrigues of a foreign court. The choice of subject was not lost on her contemporaries, some of whom saw it as a subtle justification for her own political maneuvers. Her relationship with her husband, Philip III of Navarre, Philip of Evreux, is one of both partnership and competition. Together they travel extensively through their domains, dispensing justice and overseeing administration. Yet when it comes to military matters, Philip often takes the lead, and Joan is painted in some chronicles as standing in his shadow, the brother's shadow, in more ways than one, with both her sibling and her spouse shaping her public image. In 1343, Philip dies, leaving Joan to rule as sole monarch. Freed from the constraints of shared authority, she moves quickly to reassert her independence. She appoints Navarrese-born officials to key posts, reduces the privileges of certain French nobles, and embarks on a campaign to restore neglected royal lands to the crown's control. These actions earn her newfound respect from some quarters and fresh hatred from others. By the end of her reign, Joan has weathered nearly 2 decades of political storms. When she dies in 1349, likely from the Black Death sweeping across Europe, she leaves behind a kingdom more secure than the one she inherited. And yet, the label of having been shaped, even overshadowed by her powerful male relatives, never truly fades. Standing in the Cathedral of Pamplona before her tomb, you can feel the tension in her story. A queen who ruled capably, yet always with the whisper that she was not entirely her own ruler. Was Joan II a sovereign in her own right, or a careful player moving under the gaze of more dominant kings? The truth, like a chessboard, shows both sides, and history has yet to declare checkmate. The French court in the late 15th century smells of beeswax, hot metal from the armourer's yard, and the heavy sweetness of imported oranges, a gift from Naples, meant for Queen Isabella of Aragon. Married at 18 to King Charles VIII of France, she enters a world of pageantry and calculation, her Spanish heritage both a jewel in her crown and a thorn in the side of those who resent her influence. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabella's marriage was a diplomatic bridge between France and the Aragonese kingdom of Naples. But in a court already tangled with competing factions, her foreign birth quickly became a point of attack. French courtiers accused her of favouring Spanish advisors, and Neapolitan envoys whispered that she had gone too French in her loyalties. She walked a tightrope between two crowns, and the rope frayed faster than even she could mend. Here's the quirky tidbit. Isabella kept a miniature cedar cradle in her chambers long before she had a child. Some claimed it was a devotional object, meant to honor the Christ child. Others muttered it was a symbolic gesture, a constant reminder to her ladies and her husband of her primary duty, to produce an heir. Either way, it became a talking point in the palace, an object of fascination and mockery in equal measure. Historians still argue whether the political tensions that followed were due to Isabella's own maneuvering or the impossibility of her position. In 1495, the couple's young son dies in infancy. The loss is not only personal but political. The succession is once again uncertain. In the candlelit stillness of the royal nursery, the little cradle stands empty, and the court begins to murmur about omens. You walk with her through the echoing galleries of the Château d'Amboise, the painted ceilings glittering with gold leaf. Her steps are light but deliberate, the steps of a queen who knows she is being watched from every corner. In public, she is gracious, even charming. In private, she must navigate the knife edge between her husband's ambitions in Italy and the hostility of those who see her as an outsider meddling in French affairs. When Charles VIII launches his invasion of Italy, Isabella is left to manage not only the court, but also the delicate balance of loyalty among French nobles, whose fortunes rise and fall with each battle. Reports of French excesses in Naples reach her looted churches. Seized estates and Neapolitan envoys begin to question whether she supports such actions. In her own defense, she increases patronage to religious houses in France, funding renovations and commissioning works of piety. Yet the donations, while generous, are viewed by critics as attempts to buy moral credibility. Here's another curious detail. Isabella was fascinated by medicinal gardens. She had one laid out at Amboise, in the style of a Spanish hortus conclusus, enclosed and scented with rosemary, lavender, and rue. While she claimed it was for her health, some whispered that she was experimenting with herbal concoctions, a dangerous rumor in a court where suspicion could turn medicinal practice into accusations of poison. By 1498, Charles VIII dies unexpectedly after hitting his head on a low doorway during a game of tennis, a death so abrupt and strange that the court plunges into chaos. Isabella, still only in her 20s, finds herself widowed in a foreign land, her political value suddenly diminished. The crown passes to Louis XII, and although Isabella retains her title of Dowager Queen, she has no real power. Her later years are spent largely in the quiet confines of estates in the Loire Valley, away from the intrigues that once consumed her. Yet her name continues to surface in political gossip, sometimes as the tragic young mother, sometimes as the foreign queen who could never quite be trusted. When she dies in 1524, her body is returned to Spain for burial. At her funeral, the cedar cradle she once kept in her chambers is carried behind the coffin, a symbol that in life was a demand, and in death, a reminder of both promise and loss. Standing in the dim light of the chapel where she rests, you can almost see the shape of her life. A young woman walking the invisible line between two nations, forever judged by what she could not hold a child, a kingdom, and the unwavering trust of those she ruled. The court of the Holy Roman Empire in the late 10th century smells of tallow candles, ink, and wet wool from cloaks hung near the great hall's hearth. At its center sits Theophanu, the Byzantine-born empress who married Emperor Otto II and later ruled as regent for their young son, Otto III. Draped in silks finer than any loom north of the Alps could produce, she carries with her the manners, learning, and political instincts of Constantinople, traits that would earn her both deep admiration and lasting resentment. The mainstream historical fact is that Theophanu arrived in the West in 972 as part of a marriage alliance between the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. She brought with her not only the prestige of her lineage, but also the sophisticated etiquette and administrative practices of the Eastern court. These refinements impressed some but unsettled others, who bristled at the idea of Greek influence shaping German and Italian politics. The fact that she spoke Latin with an accent and occasionally signed documents with a blend of Greek and Latin forms gave her critics even more ammunition. Here's the quirky tidbit. Theophanu was said to wear perfume made from musk and ambergris, a scent so strong it lingered in a room hours after she left. Courtiers joked that one could follow the empress through the palace simply by scent, though the jest often came with a sharp edge, implying that her presence clung too tightly to imperial affairs. Historians still argue whether her later reputation as a spy queen was fair or fabricated. What is certain is that after Otto II's sudden death in 983, Theophanu became regent for her 3-year-old son. She took an active role in governance, travelling across the empire to assert royal authority and negotiating with rebellious nobles. Her close ties to Byzantine diplomacy, cultivated through discreet correspondence and the occasional appearance of Eastern envoys, led some to accuse her of prioritizing Constantinople's interests over those of the empire she now ruled. You follow her on a winter progress through the Rhineland. The roads are treacherous, the air sharp, and the procession slow, but Theophanu insists on meeting her vassals face to face. At each stop, she listens more than she speaks, her dark eyes scanning the hall as much as the petitioners before her. These visits are not mere ceremony, they are reconnaissance. She notes which nobles hesitate to kneel, which households can afford lavish hospitality, which regions show signs of unrest. Her enemies, however, spin this vigilance into paranoia. They claim she uses a network of informants, monks, merchants, even household servants to monitor the loyalties of her subjects. One chronicler describes a banquet where Theophanu sat smiling at her guests while her scribes quietly recorded every word spoken at the table. Whether or not this actually happened, the story reinforced the idea of an empress who ruled through watchfulness and subtle coercion. Here's another curious detail. Theophanu was known to issue charters in her own name without always invoking her son's authority. This was unusual for a regent and fed accusations that she was too eager to claim sovereign power for herself. Yet the charters reveal a ruler deeply engaged in the practical work of governance, confirming land grants, settling disputes, and strengthening imperial control in Italy, where her presence was both feared and respected. Her regency was short but decisive. In just under a decade, she managed to stabilize a fractious empire, keep external threats at bay, and prepare Otto III for his future role. But the political cost was high. Theophanu died suddenly in 991 at the age of 31, likely from illness, leaving behind both a stronger imperial structure and a reputation still clouded by suspicion. In the cathedral at Cologne, where she is buried, her sarcophagus rests under a canopy carved with Byzantine motifs, a final reminder of the world she came from and the one she reshaped. Standing there, you can almost hear the faint rustle of her silks and catch a trace of that musky perfume, as if she had only just left the hall. Was Theophanu truly a spy queen, or was she simply a ruler whose keen observation and unflinching involvement in statecraft unnerved the men accustomed to holding power alone? Whatever the truth, she remains a figure who blurred the lines between East and West, leaving a legacy as layered and lasting as the scent that once followed her through the imperial corridors. The year is 1515, and the French court is a riot of silk, music, and ambition. Louise of Savoy, mother of the young King Francis I, is not just a dowager duchess tucked quietly into the background. She is, in effect, the most powerful political figure in France. At 38, with her son barely past 20, she assumes the role of regent when he rides off to war. Her velvet gowns conceal not only a shrewd mind but a willingness to use courtly spectacle as a weapon. The mainstream historical fact is that Louise twice served as regent of France, first during Francis's military campaigns in Italy, and later during his captivity in Spain. In both periods, she managed the machinery of the kingdom with a confidence that impressed some and unnerved others. She negotiated treaties, collected taxes, and kept the royal treasury from collapsing under the weight of war debts. but her authority was not universally welcomed. Nobles muttered that she wielded too much influence, and her close control of court appointments bred resentment among those excluded from her favour. Here's the quirky tidbit. Louise was obsessed with masks, not just the jewelled carnival sort worn at masquerades, but theatrical masks depicting gods, animals, and allegorical figures. She kept a cabinet of them in her apartments, claiming they reminded her of the many faces one must wear in politics. On certain evenings, she would host small gatherings where favoured courtiers wore the masks while discussing state matters, blurring the line between entertainment and intrigue. Historians still argue whether these masks at midnight were harmless eccentricities or calculated opportunities to gather candid opinions without the usual formality. In either case, they fed the image of Louise as a queen mother who used unconventional methods to maintain her edge. You follow her through the long gallery of the Château de Blois, the light of dozens of candelabra gleaming off gilt-framed tapestries. She pauses before a portrait of her son, her fingers resting lightly on the painted edge, before turning to discuss the next day's audience list with her secretary. Every detail of the court's choreography passes through her: who enters which chamber, who stands where, who receives an invitation, and who is conspicuously excluded. In 1525, disaster strikes. Francis is captured by imperial forces at the Battle of Pavia and taken to Spain. Overnight, Louise must transition from regent in peacetime to ruler in crisis. She rallies the court, sends envoys to foreign powers, and begins delicate negotiations for her son's release. Her enemies are quick to suggest she might enjoy holding the reins a little too much, that she is more interested in consolidating her power than freeing the king. Here's another curious detail. During this regency, Louise commissioned a set of silver coins stamped not only with the royal fleur-de-lis but also with her own monogram. Officially, it was a symbol of her role as guardian of the crown. Unofficially, it was seen as a bold assertion that she, and not just her absent son, embodied royal authority. The gesture inflamed those who already saw her as dangerously self-assured. After a year of tense diplomacy, Louise herself travels to Spain to oversee the final negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Madrid secures Francis's release, but at the cost of territorial concessions. Though her efforts bring the king home, some courtiers whisper that she gave away too much. Others accuse her of using the crisis to sideline rivals permanently. When Francis returns, he publicly praises his mother's service, but the undercurrent of suspicion remains. Louise retreats slightly from daily governance, but never relinquishes her role as chief advisor. In private, she still holds her midnight mass gatherings, still cultivates networks of informants, still pulls the strings of patronage. She dies in 1531. Her funeral a grand affair attended by the highest ranks of French nobility, some of whom no doubt feel a secret relief that the woman who could rule without a crown is gone. Her personal diaries, preserved in part, reveal a mind constantly calculating, always aware of appearances, always ready to adjust her mask to the moment. Standing in the quiet of her tomb in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, you can almost imagine the faint rustle of silk and the glimmer of candlelight on painted masks. Was Louise of Savoy merely an effective regent, or did she delight in the theatrical manipulation of power? Either way, she played the game with such poise that even her harshest critics could never quite unseat her. The year is 1509, and the bells of Westminster Abbey toll as Catherine of Aragon, newly crowned Queen of England, steps into her role beside the young and athletic Henry VIII. She is 23, auburn-haired, and already seasoned in the delicate art of royal survival. Her first marriage, to Henry's elder brother Arthur, ended in widowhood within months. Now, after years of uncertainty at the English court, she has married the new king and believes she has secured her place. But Catherine's story will prove that even a queen with a spotless reputation can be turned into a political problem. The mainstream historical fact is that Catherine was a devoted wife and an able queen, admired for her learning, piety, and diplomacy. She acted as Henry's regent in 1513 while he campaigned in France, and her leadership coincided with the English victory over the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. For a brief time she was celebrated as the ideal consort. Yet her inability to produce a surviving male heir changed everything. Over the years, miscarriages and infant deaths drained her physically and emotionally, and provided Henry's enemies, and eventually Henry himself, with the excuse to seek another wife. Here's the quirky tidbit. Catherine was a skilled embroiderer and personally worked on altar cloths for royal chapels. She often stitched tiny pomegranates, her personal emblem, into the designs. Courtiers noticed that as her troubles with Henry grew, the embroidered fruit became smaller and sparser, as if even her needlework reflected her diminishing hopes. Historians still argue whether Catherine's refusal to agree to an annulment was a stubborn defense of principle or a political miscalculation. From her perspective, she was Henry's lawful wife, and setting her aside would be both a moral sin and a dangerous precedent. But Henry, desperate for a male heir and captivated by Anne Boleyn, began the long process of breaking from Rome to dissolve their marriage. You walk with her through the draughty halls of Greenwich Palace during the tense early 1532. Catherine moves with deliberate dignity, her dark eyes calm, even when the council presses her to accept the king's terms. She answers them in measured tones, invoking both scripture and her own status as a princess of Spain. To her, this is not merely a domestic dispute, it is a battle for the legitimacy of her daughter, Mary, and for her own honour. Her enemies at court seize the chance to paint her as obstinate and uncooperative. Pamphlets circulate, claiming she clings to her crown out of pride rather than love, that she is a widow queen, living on borrowed authority. Supporters in London, however, cheer her openly, some wearing badges with the pomegranate emblem in solidarity. Here's another curious detail. Catherine was known for fasting more rigorously than required, even during Lent. In her later years, she reportedly ate so little that foreign ambassadors commented on her frailty. Some saw this as a spiritual discipline. Others whispered it was a form of political theatre, a way to present herself as a martyr in the face of injustice. By 1533, Henry's patience ends. He marries Anne Boleyn in secret, has the marriage declared valid by a compliant archbishop, and strips Catherine of her title. She is moved from palace to palace, effectively under house arrest, and forbidden to see her daughter. Her correspondence is monitored, though smuggled letters still reach her from loyal friends and Spanish envoys. In these, she signs herself not Princess Dowager of Wales, the title Henry insists on, but Queen of England. The final years of her life are spent at Kimbolton Castle, where the damp stone walls and English winters take their toll. She spends her days in prayer, reading, and embroidery, the pomegranate still appearing in her work. When she dies in January 1536, she is buried quietly at Peterborough Abbey, denied the state funeral befitting a queen. Yet at her funeral mass, the crowd wears black and crimson, her colours, as if to stage one last defiance. Standing in the echoing nave of the abbey today, you can almost hear the murmur of her final words to her servants. A blessing for Henry, for Mary, and for England itself. Was she the widow's grasp, clinging stubbornly to power she should have surrendered, or a queen who refused to let politics erase her dignity? Perhaps she was both, but history has rarely rewarded steadfastness as generously as it has cunning. Catherine's legacy endures not in the crown she wore, but in the quiet strength with which she refused to take it off. The year is 1328, and the grey skies over Westminster seem to mirror the mood of England's merchants. Philippa of Hainaut, newly arrived from the Low Countries, has married Edward III and taken her place as queen. Her marriage is the result of a long-negotiated alliance between England and her native Hainaut, but already her presence is stirring unease among London's trading guilds and noble families alike. She is foreign, young, and to some eyes, too closely tied to commercial interests that threaten the old balance of power. The mainstream historical fact is that Philippa was celebrated in her lifetime for her gentleness and generosity, especially compared to some of her contemporaries. She interceded to spare the lives of the burghers of Calais in 1347, an act that chroniclers turned into one of the most enduring tales of mercy in medieval history. But beneath this soft image was a queen deeply entangled with England's merchant elite. Her connections to Hainaut brought not only military aid for Edward's campaigns, but also lucrative trade ties in wool and cloth. And it was these ties that fueled accusations she was in the pocket of wealthy guilds. Here's the quirky tidbit. Philippa was so fond of fine textiles that she kept a rotating wardrobe guard, two women whose sole duty was to air, fold, and display her gowns so she could inspect them at will. These garments often came directly from her home region, bypassing English producers. To the mercers and weavers of London, it was a personal insult, as if the Queen herself were advertising foreign goods over domestic craft. Historians still argue whether her reliance on Hainaut merchants was born of genuine loyalty to her homeland or simply the practical choice for a queen managing vast household expenses. Either way, her patronage of foreign traders made her a target for resentment, especially during the costly years of the 100 Years' War, when taxes rose and English merchants felt squeezed out. You walk with her through the bustling docks of London on a rare public outing. She moves with the poise of someone aware she is on display, smiling faintly at the cheers from some quarters while ignoring the muttered complaints from others. The smell of tar, salt, and spices hangs in the air as bales of imported cloth are unloaded from ships flying the banners of Hainaut and Flanders. To her supporters, this is the Queen ensuring the kingdom's prosperity. To her critics, it's proof she serves the interests of her merchant kin over her adopted people. Her political influence grows during Edward's absences on campaign. She oversees the royal household, manages estates, and authorizes trade agreements. Each decision is an opportunity for detractors to accuse her of favoritism. In the taverns near Cheapside, there are whispers that she is the merchant's puppet, a queen who dances to the tune of gold florins rather than the needs of England's poor. Here's another curious detail. During a particularly tense dispute between English and Flemish cloth merchants, Philippa hosted a grand feast where the seating arrangements placed rival trade leaders side by side. Chroniclers noted that while the food was sumptuous, the air was thick with barely concealed hostility. She spent the evening moving from table to table, diffusing tempers with warm conversation. By morning, several minor trade agreements had been struck, but the larger grievances remained unresolved. Her later years see her reputation soften somewhat, particularly as her acts of charity and patronage overshadow the earlier trade disputes. Still, among certain guild circles, the memory lingers of a queen whose heart and purse strings seem to be tied to foreign looms. When she dies in 1369, she is buried in Westminster Abbey with full honours, mourned as a beloved consort. Yet the epitaph carved into her memory is complicated. A queen of mercy, yes, but also a monarch whose economic choices fed the quiet grumblings of those left outside her circle of favour. Standing by her tomb, you see the carved figure of Philippa lying serenely, hands clasped in prayer, a small dog curled at her feet, a symbol of loyalty. Whether that loyalty was to England, to her husband, or to the merchant network that sustained her, remains one of the subtler riddles of her reign. The year is 1643, and the air in Paris hums with a tension you can almost taste musk from perfumed gloves, mingles with the sharper scent of candle soot, and everywhere people are whispering about the new regent. Anne of Austria, widow of Louis XIII and mother to the young Louis XIV, has taken the reins of France. For years, she had been treated as a foreign ornament at court, her Spanish birth an easy target for gossip. Now, with her husband gone and her son just 4 years old, she holds real power for the first time, and her enemies are sharpening their knives. The mainstream historical fact is that Anne's regency was dominated by her alliance with Cardinal Mazarin, a partnership that provoked widespread suspicion. To many nobles, Mazarin was a scheming Italian interloper, and Anne's trust in him looked less like wise delegation and more like personal indulgence. The Fronde, A series of civil uprisings erupted partly in response to this perceived corruption and foreign influence, plunging France into years of political chaos. Here's the quirky tidbit. Anne was notorious for her fondness for elaborate letter, locking a folding and sealing technique so complex it could take minutes just to open a single missive without tearing it. She used coloured silks, wax seals, and intricate folds that, according to one courtier, made her correspondence look more like art projects than state documents. Her opponents mocked this as vanity. Her supporters insisted it was a clever security measure. Historians still argue whether Anne's reliance on Mazarin was a matter of political necessity or personal choice. She had been sidelined for much of her marriage, excluded from major decisions, and even suspected of espionage for Spain. When Louis XIII died, she moved quickly to consolidate her position, securing legal changes that gave her far more freedom as regent than any recent queen had enjoyed. Whether she truly trusted Mazarin or simply found in him the best available ally remains an open question. You follow her into the council chamber, where sunlight filters through tall windows and gilded moulding glints at the edges of every frame. She sits in a high-backed chair, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable, as noblemen debate tax levies and troop movements. When she does speak, it is in slow, deliberate phrases that leave no room for misinterpretation. Her accent is still Spanish-tinged, and you can sense the way some of the councillors flinch at it, a reminder that, to them, she will never be entirely French. As the Fronde intensifies, pamphlets flood the streets accusing her of everything from mismanaging the treasury to plotting to marry Mazarin in secret. Satirical drawings show her draped in Spanish lace while Mazarin counts gold coins at her feet. In one particularly cruel broadside, she is depicted as a marionette with Mazarin's hand pulling the strings. These images stick, shaping her reputation for generations. Here's another curious detail. During the worst unrest, Anne took to wearing plain black gowns in public, a stark contrast to her usual sumptuous attire. Some took this as a sign of mourning for the fractured state of the kingdom. Others saw it as calculated symbolism, a way to present herself as a sober, self-sacrificing mother to the future king. Either way, it became one of the enduring visual impressions of her regency. Despite the upheaval, Anne survives the Fronde with her authority intact, partly thanks to her willingness to bend without breaking. She makes strategic concessions, retreats when necessary, and waits for her opponents to overplay their hand. By the time Louis XIV comes of age, the monarchy is secure again, and Anne withdraws from public life, content to let her son and his ministers take centre stage. She dies in 1666, her final years spent in religious devotion at the Val de Grace, the convent she had founded in gratitude for the birth of her son. Even in death, her reputation remains split down the middle. To some, she is the foreign queen who almost let France slip into ruin. To others, she is the steel-willed regent who navigated the kingdom through one of its most dangerous political storms. Standing before her tomb, you can almost hear the soft crackle of sealed paper and see the dark eyes watching you, calculating whether you're friend or foe. Anne of Austria learned that a queen's greatest weapon is not the sword, but the art of deciding exactly when to speak and when to let others wonder what she's thinking. The year is 1295, and in the draughty great hall of Stirling Castle, Isabella of Mar is presented as the new bride of Robert the Bruce. She is barely a teenager, her pale skin framed by a crown of reddish gold hair, her hands clasped tightly as if holding on to courage. Though her life as queen consort will be short, Isabella will come to occupy a complicated place in Scotland's story, both cherished for her lineage and criticised for what some saw as her inability to weather the storm of her husband's ambitions. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabella's marriage to Robert the Bruce united two powerful Scottish houses, strengthening his claim to the throne. But her position was perilous from the start. Scotland was in the throes of political upheaval, caught between the influence of England and the fragile unity of its own nobility. While Robert manoeuvred for power, Isabella was expected to charm allies, reassure the clans, and embody the stability the kingdom so desperately needed. Here's the quirky tidbit. Isabella was known for carrying a small carved horn cup wherever she went, said to have been a wedding gift from her father. She drank from it at every meal, even when gold and silver goblets were offered. Some said it was for good luck. Others claimed it was a quiet statement of loyalty to her Mar heritage over the Bruce cause. Historians still argue whether Isabella played any meaningful role in Robert's political machinations, or if she was largely a ceremonial figure. The records are thin, but what survives suggests she attended councils, received envoys, and even accompanied Robert on some journeys through contested territories, a visible endorsement of his leadership, at a time when legitimacy mattered as much as military strength. You follow her into the small solar overlooking the castle yard, where she sits stitching by the window. Outside, men train with swords in the frost-bitten air, their breath rising in clouds. Inside, Isabella's needle moves with measured precision, each loop of thread neat and deliberate. She glances at the commotion in the yard, her expression a mix of pride and unease. She knows that every victory for Robert could bring more enemies, and that the title of Queen Consort offers little real protection. In 1296, Edward I of England invades Scotland, and Robert temporarily bends the knee. The political tides turn quickly and violently. Isabella, still in her teens, must endure the whispers that her husband's loyalties are negotiable. Some blame her for not softening his shifting allegiances. Others pity her for being caught between rival powers too large to control. Here's another curious detail. Isabella reportedly insisted on bringing her own food tasters when travelling with Robert, a habit she kept even during visits to her own family's estates. Whether this was simple caution or a sign of deeper mistrust in the shifting loyalties of the Scottish nobility is unknown, but it added to her image as a young queen already wary of those around her. Her time in the role is tragically brief. Isabella dies in 1296, likely in childbirth, after bearing Robert a daughter, Marjorie Bruce. That daughter will go on to be a key link in the royal line, mother of Robert II, and the start of the Stuart dynasty. But Isabella herself does not live to see it. Her death leaves Robert politically disadvantaged, forcing him to seek another alliance through marriage. Yet in some ways, Isabella's absence solidifies her legacy. Without the later controversies that might have accompanied a longer reign, she is remembered in a strange dual light. The fair queen who died too soon, and the would-be stabilizer of a realm that never gave her the chance to prove herself. Standing in the quiet nave of the church where she is believed to be buried, you can almost picture her with that carved horn cup in hand, offering a brief smile in the flickering candlelight. Was she truly the luckless bride whose death left Scotland's fate more uncertain? Or was her life simply the first casualty of a throne forever caught between war and ambition? Either way, her story is a reminder that in medieval courts, even queens could be pawns, and pawns rarely survive the opening moves. The year is 1191, and the blazing Cypriot sun glints off the sea as Berengaria of Navarre steps ashore. She has just married Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, in a ceremony that was as much a political convenience as a romantic union. The salty wind whips her veil, and somewhere behind her on the dock, merchants are already weighing the cost and gain of her arrival. Berengaria will never set foot in England during her husband's reign, and yet she will bear the title of Queen, a fact that will feed both gossip and resentment for centuries. The mainstream historical fact is that Berengaria's marriage to Richard was arranged to secure alliances and strengthen Angevin influence. It was politically useful that she was not French, given Richard's tense relations with King Philip II of France. Their wedding, held in Limassol during the Third Crusade, was attended by a host of knights and clerics. Yet despite her elevated title, Berengaria was conspicuously absent from England, a queen in name, who lived most of her married life in Aquitaine, or elsewhere in Europe. Here's the quirky tidbit. Berengaria was said to keep a portable altar small enough to be set up in a ship's cabin or a roadside tent. She travelled with it everywhere, ensuring she could attend Mass daily regardless of the chaos around her. Some contemporaries thought this piety admirable. Others suspected it was a sign she preferred the quiet routines of devotion to the messy realities of court politics. Historians still argue whether her absence from England was her choice or Richard's design. Some suggest she disliked the damp and fractious English court. Others claim Richard, often away on crusade or imprisoned abroad, simply saw no need to bring her there. Whatever the reason, her invisibility in England gave fuel to those who considered her a useless ornament rather than a working queen. You follow her caravan as it winds through the sun-baked roads of the Levant, soldiers trudging alongside merchants laden with bolts of silk and amphorae of wine. She rides with a straight back, her eyes shielded by a wide-brimmed hat, occasionally speaking with her ladies, but more often gazing at the horizon. There is a loneliness about her, though she does not show it openly, the loneliness of a woman who holds a crown but not a court. When Richard is captured and held for ransom in Germany, Berengaria attempts to contribute to his release, but her political influence is minimal. She sends letters, makes donations, and petitions allies. Yet decisions are made without her. By the time Richard is freed, their marriage is already strained by distance, absence, and whispers of the king's infidelity or indifference that Berengaria never publicly addresses. Here's another curious detail. Berengaria was deeply interested in herb cultivation. While living in Le Mans in her later years, she kept gardens filled with rosemary, sage, and rue, supposedly using them to create remedies for local villagers. This practical charity softened her image locally, though it did little to alter her reputation in England, where she remained a largely forgotten figure. After Richard's death in 1199, Berengaria is left childless, and with little provision from the English crown. She spends years petitioning successive kings for the pension owed to her as Dowager Queen. Eventually, she receives partial payment, but by then she has chosen to retire to an abbey in Le Mans, living a life of relative quiet until her death in 1230. In England, her legacy is peculiar. She is remembered less for anything she did than for what she did not do. She never produced an heir, never established herself in the English court, and never became a beloved national figure. Yet in Aquitaine and Navarre, her name carries a faint echo of the queen who lived on her own terms, however narrow those terms may have been. Standing in the cloister garden where she is buried, the rosemary bushes still whisper in the wind. You imagine her walking among them, portable altar stored in her chamber, far from the noise of royal feuds and the damp halls she never called home. Was Berengaria of Navarre the absent queen, a symbol of wasted opportunity, or simply a woman who realized early that England would never be hers? The year is 1445, and the air in Tours is thick with incense and ceremony as Margaret of Anjou, a 15-year-old French noblewoman, marries England's King Henry VI. Her gown is a masterpiece of crimson velvet and seed pearls, but her eyes betray a sharper edge than her age might suggest. She has been chosen not for her dowry, there is none, but for the promise of peace between England and France during the waning years of the 100 Years' War. What she will inherit instead is a fractured realm and a husband ill-suited to the brutal demands of kingship. The mainstream historical fact is that Margaret became one of the most polarizing figures in English history. As Henry's mental health declined, she emerged as the dominant force in court politics, making decisions on his behalf and fiercely defending the rights of their only son, Edward of Westminster. Her leadership, however, coincided with the eruption of the Wars of the Roses, and her active role in the conflict earned her a reputation as a meddler, even a usurper in all but name. Here's the quirky tidbit. Margaret reportedly travelled with a small personal library in ornately carved chests, filled with volumes in both French and Latin. Even on military campaigns, she would have them carried from encampment to encampment, sometimes reading aloud to her ladies in the evenings, a disarming image of scholarly calm against the backdrop of civil war. Historians still argue whether her political aggressiveness was born of necessity or ambition. With Henry incapacitated for long stretches and surrounded by power-hungry nobles, Margaret may have felt she had no choice but to step into the vacuum. Yet the manner in which she championed her faction, favoring loyalists with titles and land, while ruthlessly sidelining rivals, only deepened animosities. You ride with her through the damp, churned fields of the Midlands in 1455, her retinue bristling with armed men. She sits astride her palfrey with the same rigid posture she uses in council chambers, her voice cutting through the mist as she issues orders. The banners of Lancaster snap in the wind, a vivid crimson against the grey sky. She knows that every mile brings her closer to another clash with the Yorkist forces who call her the French she-wolf. In London, pamphlets lampoon her as a foreign temptress who controls the king with whispered counsel. In Yorkist propaganda, she is accused of plotting to place her son, rumoured by some to be illegitimate, on the throne at any cost. Margaret ignores these insults publicly, but in private she rages, pacing the floors of her temporary residences while trusted envoys bring her intelligence from across the realm. Here's another curious detail. On at least one occasion, she is said to have disguised herself in plain woolen garments to travel incognito and avoid capture. Chroniclers note that she kept her speech to a minimum, fearing her French accent would betray her. Whether this episode is entirely factual or embellished, it fits the image of a queen willing to use cunning as readily as ceremony. The years drag on, battles won and lost, fortunes rising and falling. After the Lancastrians are decisively defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, where her son Edward is killed, Margaret is taken prisoner. She is eventually ransomed by her cousin, King Louis XI of France, and returns to her homeland a widow and a mother with no heir. She spends her final years in relative obscurity, living modestly on a small pension and fading from the political stage. Yet the memory of her in England remains potent, a queen who dared to rule in her own right, and in doing so, invited a level of hatred few women of her rank had endured before. Standing now in the quiet of Angers Cathedral, where she is buried, you can almost hear the rustle of banners in the wind and the clipped cadence of her voice across a battlefield. Was Margaret of Anjou the she-wolf her enemies feared, or was she simply the only one in a crumbling kingdom willing to bare her teeth? The year is 1180, and the bells of Paris ring out for the coronation of a new queen, Isabella of Hainaut, just 10 years old, the child bride of Philip II of France. Draped in a gown far too heavy for her small frame, she looks every bit the picture of medieval royalty, though she is scarcely old enough to understand the court's tangled webs. Her marriage seals an alliance between France and the powerful county of Flanders, bringing a substantial dowry of territories that Philip is eager to claim. For a while, she is seen as the jewel of the realm. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabel's early reign was marked by political maneuvering over her dowry lands. Philip, ambitious and calculating even as a young king, soon moved to seize full control of these territories, sparking tension with her Flemish relatives. When he attempted to annul the marriage on the grounds of alleged consanguinity, it nearly triggered open war. Her position as queen, once secure, began to look precarious. Here's the quirky tidbit. Isabel was known for her fascination with falconry. She kept a small mews of hawks and falcons at the royal palace, tending them personally when she could. She once gifted her husband a rare white gerfalcon from the north, a gesture intended to mend a rift between them, though it's doubtful the bird did much to change Philip's political calculus. Historians still argue whether Isabel was a passive figure swept along by the currents of her husband's ambition, or a quiet operator using her limited influence to protect her own interests. Chroniclers suggest she appealed directly to the citizens of Paris when threatened with annulment, appearing in public barefoot and dressed in penitential white, accompanied by a procession of clergy. The dramatic display reportedly swayed popular opinion in her favour and forced Philip to reconsider. You follow her through the winding streets of the Ile de la Cité, the cold stones echoing with the murmurs of townsfolk who bow as she passes. She meets their gazes with a mixture of humility and steel, aware that her survival as queen depends as much on the goodwill of the people as on the shifting loyalties of the nobility. The marriage stabilizes, at least outwardly, but Isabel remains under constant scrutiny. Court gossip paints her as fragile, too timid for the ruthless politics of the Capetian court. Yet her actions suggest a subtler resolve. She supports religious houses, negotiates discreetly with her own kin, and quietly fosters goodwill among influential courtiers who might one day defend her position. Here's another curious detail. Isabel was said to wear a small reliquary around her neck, containing a splinter of the true cross, which she would press to her lips before speaking in council. Whether this was a genuine act of devotion or a calculated symbol of piety is impossible to know, but it added to her image as a morally upright queen in a court often driven by greed. In 1190, Isabel accompanies Philip on the early stages of the Third Crusade. Though she does not remain for the full campaign, her presence at the outset is meant to project unity and royal authority. The strain of travel and the pressures of court life take their toll, and by 1190 she is pregnant with her first child. Tragically, she dies in childbirth at just 19, leaving behind a single son who will not survive infancy. Her death allows Philip to reclaim her dowry lands outright, an outcome some historians view as the king's long-sought objective. In death, Isabel is remembered less for her political entanglements than for the brief moments when she seemed to step out of the role of passive consort barefoot before the people, a hawk on her wrist, a reliquary at her throat, and remind France that a queen, however young, could still wield influence. Standing in the shadow of Notre Dame, where her funeral mass was held, you can almost hear the distant flutter of wings and the quiet murmurs of a queen who learned early that survival at court often depends not on loud defiance, but on knowing exactly when to appear and what image to project. The year is 1469, and the winter winds sweep across the grey towers of Copenhagen as Dorothea of Brandenburg tightens her fur-lined cloak. Twice a queen, already first of Denmark and Norway through her marriage to King Christopher III, and then of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden as the wife of King Christian I, she has learned that crowns bring both privilege and peril. Dorothea's rule will be long, strategic, and deeply unpopular in certain circles, particularly for her relentless pursuit of her children's inheritance and her political meddling long after her official queenship ended. The mainstream historical fact is that Dorothea wielded extraordinary influence during and after her marriages. She acted as a political broker in the Kalmar Union, attempting to keep the Scandinavian kingdoms united under her family's control. Even after Christian I's death in 1481, she continued to be a formidable player in regional politics, negotiating alliances, collecting revenues, and lobbying the Pope when disputes over succession arose. Her persistence in reclaiming lands and titles for her sons often placed her in direct conflict with powerful noble factions in all three kingdoms. Here's the quirky tidbit. Dorothea had a fondness for keeping exotic birds in a heated aviary, an unusual luxury in the Nordic climate. These included parrots brought by Hanseatic merchants from far-off ports. Visitors to her court often remarked on the sight and sound of her conversing with the birds while conducting business, as if she enjoyed unnerving her guests with the constant chatter. Historians still argue whether her political maneuvering was driven by genuine devotion to her sons' futures or by an unquenchable personal ambition. Her critics painted her as a schemer who clung to influence she should have relinquished, accusing her of draining the treasury and using church influence to pressure political rivals. Her supporters saw her as a guardian of dynastic stability in an era when kingdoms could dissolve through one bad marriage or an untimely death. You walk with her through the echoing halls of Nyborg Castle, her steps purposeful as she dictates letters to scribes. The documents will travel by ship to Lübeck, Stockholm, and Rome, each a carefully worded message meant to sway a different power broker. Outside, the harbour creaks with ice-bound ships, their masts clattering in the wind. Inside, Dorothea's voice is warm but firm, the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her disputes with the Swedish nobility are especially bitter. When they resist her son's claim to the throne, she appeals directly to the Pope, framing the issue as a moral obligation to honour her late husband's agreements. It is an unprecedented move for a dowager queen, and it wins her no friends in Sweden. Nobles there begin circulating verses mocking her as the widow who would be king. Here's another curious detail. Dorothea is said to have kept a chest of correspondence from her 2 reigns, meticulously organized by kingdom, year, and opponent. It was rumored she occasionally reread letters from adversaries she had bested, smiling faintly as if replaying a favorite chess match. Her later years are spent in political half-light, officially retired from power, yet constantly consulted or blamed for behind-the-scenes machinations. She lives comfortably in Ribes and other royal estates, still collecting rents and managing her considerable properties. Her aviary remains a constant, the birds' cries echoing through the corridors even as she becomes increasingly reclusive. When she dies in 1495, she leaves behind a complicated reputation. In Denmark, she is remembered as a tenacious protector of royal prerogatives. In Sweden, as an overreaching foreign meddler. In Norway, as a figure more symbolic than present. Yet across all these lands, no one doubts that she was one of the most politically skilled women of her age. Standing in Ribes Cathedral where she is buried, you can almost hear the faint rustle of feathers and the scrape of quills on parchment. Dorothea of Brandenburg understood better than most that a queen's power need not end with her husband's life, and that sometimes the quiet rustle of papers can be as dangerous as the clash of swords. The year is 1235, and the spires of Mainz gleam in the summer sun as Isabella of England, sister to King Henry III, weds Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire. The marriage is a glittering affair, full of gilded processions, jeweled harnesses for horses, and elaborate feasts that seem designed to broadcast the empire's power to every prince and bishop in attendance. At just 21, Isabella steps into one of the most politically complex courts in Europe, a court where the emperor is both feared and mistrusted, and where an English queen consort will always be viewed as a foreign intrusion. The mainstream historical fact is that Isabella's marriage to Frederick was intended to cement Anglo-imperial relations, but it quickly soured. Frederick's ambitions often lay in Italy, not in fostering ties with England, and Isabella was kept largely in seclusion at his southern courts. Chroniclers note that she had little real influence over imperial policy, but she did maintain her own household and cultivated a network of allies among the nobility, even as her isolation deepened. Here's the quirky tidbit. Isabella reportedly travelled to the empire with a personal troupe of English musicians, including players of the viol, harp and tabor. They became an unusual fixture at Frederick's otherwise Italianate court, and some guests noted the jarring mix of English ballads drifting through palaces more accustomed to troubadour songs from Provence or Sicily. Historians still argue whether her restricted movements were the result of deliberate control by Frederick or a pragmatic measure to shield her from the dangerous politics of the imperial court. Some accounts paint her as a passive figure overshadowed by Frederick's other consorts and mistresses. Others suggest she quietly asserted herself through patronage and strategic correspondence with her family back in England. You walk with her in the citrus-scented gardens of her residence in Apulia, the sea breeze heavy with salt and rosemary. She moves with grace, but speaks sparingly, the cadence of her English lilting against the more fluid Italian around her. The letters she sends home are careful, polite about her husband, vague about her own role, but between the lines there is a sense of yearning for the independence she had known before her marriage. Her relationship with Frederick is complex. He values her as a political symbol, but rarely as a partner in governance. When he embarks on his campaigns in Lombardy, she is left behind for months at a time, surrounded by courtiers whose loyalty lies squarely with the emperor. Rumours swirl that she is unhappy, but the court's code of discretion means few will speak openly. Here's another curious detail. Isabella is said to have kept a small aviary of nightingales, claiming their songs reminded her of the English countryside. The birds were so cherished that she instructed her attendants to carry their cages with her during seasonal relocations between imperial residences. In 1241, Isabella dies in childbirth at Foggia, only 6 years into her marriage. Her death is mourned formally but without the public display that might have been expected for an empress. Frederick, ever pragmatic, moves swiftly to address the political fallout, securing alliances to fill the gaps her absence leaves. In England, her passing is met with quiet grief. Henry III orders masses for her soul, but the physical distance between her homeland and final resting place mirrors the emotional gulf that had existed during her marriage. She is buried in Andria Cathedral, her tomb later becoming a modest pilgrimage site for those curious about the Englishwoman who became a distant empress. Standing beside that tomb, the marble cool under your fingertips, you can almost hear the faint echo of harp strings and the soft call of nightingales. Isabella of England's life reminds you that a queen's crown may glitter, but if it is worn in isolation, it can feel heavier than any chain. The year is 1328, and the candlelit nave of Notre Dame glows with gold as Blanche of Navarre, barely 16, marries Charles IV of France, the last Capetian king of the direct line. Her pale hair catches the flicker of the tapers, her eyes darting to the assembled bishops and dukes, as though she knows she has been dropped into a court where alliances shift as quickly as candle flames gutter. France is on the brink of a dynastic crisis, and this marriage, meant to secure the succession, will instead place her at the center of one of the most bitter transitions in French history. The mainstream historical fact is that Blanche's marriage to Charles IV lasted only a matter of months before he died, leaving her a pregnant widow in a kingdom desperate for a male heir. The Salic law, which barred women from inheriting the French throne, meant that her unborn child's sex would determine whether the Capetian line continued or whether the crown passed to a cousin. This uncertainty turned her into a guarded symbol, simultaneously revered and scrutinized, her every movement watched for signs of the child she carried. Here's the quirky tidbit. Blanche was said to have an unusual fondness for wearing rings on nearly every finger, each set with a different stone: sapphire for faith, garnet for courage, emerald for wisdom. Courtiers joked that she could signal an entire sentence with her hands if she wished, a silent language of power and intent. Historians still argue whether her seclusion after Charles's death was voluntary or imposed by those who wished to control the narrative of the succession. Some chronicles describe her as being surrounded only by loyal attendants and midwives, her rooms guarded at all hours to prevent any tampering with the outcome of her pregnancy. Others suggest she retreated willingly, knowing her safety and her child's future depended on it. You move with her through the hushed corridors of the royal apartments, where the winter light slants pale through mullioned windows. She sits at a writing desk, her quill scratching across parchment as she drafts letters to her family in Navarre, careful to report only what will not be twisted into gossip. Outside her door, guards shift their weight, their armor clinking softly in the cold. When Blanche gives birth to a daughter, Jean, the Capetian direct line ends, and the crown passes to Philip VI of Valois. It is a political earthquake, setting the stage for the 100 Years' War. In an instant, Blanche's position shifts from queen consort and potential mother of kings to dowager queen, her role reduced to ceremonial appearances and the upbringing of her child. Here's another curious detail. After her confinement, Blanche took to riding daily in the gardens of her estates, even in poor weather. She wore a long white mantle, and villagers along her route came to call her La Reine Blanche, the White Queen, a title that would follow her for the rest of her life. Half affectionate, half mocking, Blanche never remarries, though her beauty and royal blood make her a sought-after match in diplomatic circles. Instead, she dedicates herself to securing a good marriage for Jean, eventually arranging her betrothal to Charles II of Navarre. Through this alliance, Blanche maintains a thread of influence, weaving her daughter into the dynastic tapestry of both France and Navarre. Her later years are marked by quiet patronage of religious houses and occasional mediation in disputes between her natal and marital families. She becomes something of an enigmatic figure, a queen who held the fate of a dynasty in her womb, only to watch that destiny slip away with the cry of a newborn girl. Standing in the Abbey of Maubuisson, where she spends much of her final years, you can almost see her in the cloister, white mantle flowing, fingers glittering with a dozen stones, her gaze cool but distant. Blanche of Navarre's reign was fleeting, yet its consequences rippled for generations. She may not have been hated for cruelty or corruption, but for some in France, she was the queen who failed to deliver a king, and in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics, that was enough to place her among the most resented women of her age. Now that the last candle has burned low in these vaulted halls of history, let your thoughts drift from the clamour of courts and the rustle of silk to something softer, slower. The voices of these queens, fierce, cunning, tragic, and resilient, fade into the hush of the night, each leaving behind the faint trace of a story half remembered, like a scent carried on a passing breeze. You have walked beside them through cold corridors and along sunlit terraces, watched battles unfold in the distance, and stood at the edges of whispered intrigue. Picture yourself now beneath a vaulted sky, the air calm, the moon, a pale coin resting among the stars. The noise of history recedes, replaced by the sound of your own breath, steady and unhurried. The weight of crowns and the sharpness of ambition dissolve here, in the quiet that belongs only to you. Perhaps, somewhere in the stillness, you imagine these women not in their finery or under the watch of their enemies, but simply at peace, a queen with her hawk on her wrist, another tending rosemary in her garden, another laughing softly as a nightingale sings. The world beyond this moment can wait. Here, in the glow of memory and the safety of night, you are free to let each image slip gently away, until they are only shapes in the dark, distant but not gone. Rest now as the great stone halls fade and the stories close their heavy doors. And when you wake, you might find that you carry with you some small part of what they left behind, the resolve to stand straighter, speak truer, or simply to know that even in the face of history's judgment, a quiet dignity can outlast the noise.